Services and Military Veterans Affairs. I am joined with my colleagues, City Councilor Andrea Campbell, City Council President, and City Councilor Matt O'Malley, City Councilor Kim Janey. I want to remind you that this public hearing is being recorded and will be broadcast on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and online. At this time, please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will also take public testimony and would appreciate it if you would sign in and check off the box to testify. Please state your name and affiliation, residence, and limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. Today's hearing is on docket number 0536, order for a hearing regarding vacant properties in the City of Boston. This is an important hearing today, and I'd like to thank City Councilors O'Malley, City Councilor Campbell for sponsoring this hearing. The current Boston real estate market has left residents and businesses facing higher rents and displaced communities at times. This hearing is to discuss the recent issues regarding high-end blight in luxury units purchased for investments that are then left empty. Our city has a housing crisis and luxury units left empty only to make this problem worse. Many of these vacant luxury condos and apartments are not homes, but wealth storage units. In addition, prior census data has shown that more housing units in Boston are being held for seasonal or occasional use. I am glad to join my fellow city councilors at this hearing today and hope we can work forward addressing this issue. I look forward to hearing from the city departments, small business owners, and residents in today's hearing. At this time, I would like to invite my colleague, City Councilor Matt O'Malley, if he has any opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to begin by thanking my dear friend and co-sponsor of this important hearing order, City Council President Andrea Campbell, for her partnership in this, as well as you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this expedited hearing today. We're dealing with this somewhat counterintuitive notion in the City of Boston, where we have the strongest real estate market in our nearly 400-year history, yet we are seeing many mostly commercial spaces that are staying vacant for long and longer periods of time. We also have some of the newer, higher-end, high-rent residential units that are also staying local as well. The third issue has been, which I know we're going to get to in a minute, is sort of these empty lots that you'll often see around some of the cities, and it doesn't seem to make sense given the fact that this is such an unprecedented building boom. Vacant properties have many causes. Sometimes it can be that a rent is too high to keep a tenant, or not offering a property for rent at all while waiting for its value to rise, or even the city's permitting process. We're not blameless in this conversation. What is clear is that no matter what the cause is or where the vacant property is located, vacancy causes holes in the fabric of our neighborhoods. The conversation we're going to have this afternoon is inspired by a problem many of my constituents have noticed in our neighborhoods. Some buildings on our main streets remain vacant for year after year after year. I can cite several in West Roxbury and Jamaica Plain that have been vacant for 5, 6, sometimes even 10 years of vacancy. I understand that the real estate market is cyclical. I understand that things take time. But there seems to be a real problem here, which is having reverberations on other businesses as well. The hearing is to encourage especially small businesses and their surrounding neighborhoods have the opportunity to thrive. In some areas with an empty storefront, you will see businesses having a revenue drop by up to 25%, according to a study by the Boston Globe. Foot traffic declines when there's a vacant storefront nearby. Moreover, data from the census of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council has shown that more of our housing units are also sitting vacant in high-end apartment buildings. As we build more, we're also seeing the number of vacant units increase. Leaving these apartments vacant puts pressures on our scarce housing stock in the same way that more units given over to Airbnb can increase rents. We want our storefronts and apartment buildings to be filled with people who can contribute to the vibrancy of our city. That's why I'm hoping we'll tackle the problem of vacancies, starting by coming together today to gather information on this problem and explore a whole range of solutions. Possible steps forward include a comprehensive data collection on vacancies in the City of Boston, potential fee levied on long-term vacant properties to incentivize landlords to put properties on the market with reasonable rents, as well as enhancing opportunities to fill the vacant space through streamlining the permitting process and supporting pop-up use of empty space. Now, this is a problem that's facing New York, San Francisco, and cities around the globe as well, and they're exploring different concepts such as the vacancy fee. I'm particularly excited to hear the successful model that has been used in Boston's close neighbor of the town of Arlington, which we will hear from during the second panel. We cannot allow Boston's neighborhoods to have long-term vacancies on our streets because landlords are simply holding out for higher rent. We have to tackle this issue alongside all forms of blight to make every street in our neighborhood vibrant. Another experience in my district is that there was a long-standing workplace for 20 artists that were evicted earlier this year to make way for condo development. The neighborhood spoke out against evicting the arts from their community and artists practicing their craft or small businesses as well. Unfortunately, now what we have is an empty building where the new landlord has already alienated most of the community by kicking out some vibrant local businesses, and it's going to sit empty for years to come. That's why this is about affordability as much as it is about activating our streets. As more people and businesses move to our city, we should make sure that we're using every available tool in our policy toolbox and to keep every property activated and used. In a growing Boston in 2018, we should not have empty storefronts when we have entrepreneurs ready to fill them. Simply put, Boston should not have people without homes when we currently have some homes without people. I'm looking forward to beginning this conversation with all of you. Thank you to my colleagues for their engagement as well.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. At this time, I'd like to ask City Council President Andrea Campbell for opening comments.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn, and I want to thank you as well as Councilor O'Malley for being partners in this, and specifically Councilor O'Malley for partnering in this work. I know it's something you care deeply about, so thank you for the partnership. I want to thank all the department heads who are here and acknowledge the hard work you do every single day to address these very issues, and I look forward to the discussion today, but I want to at least start with a thank you to you and your teams who frankly aren't represented here, who help us deal with these vacant, abandoned lots every single day. Councilor O'Malley and I are coming at this, I think, with some shared goals and expectations, but when we first were having a conversation, he was focusing on largely the businesses that lie vacant or that are abandoned and aren't doing anything with those spaces. My angle was more of the residential units, the properties that are vacant, abandoned, or considered problem properties by the City of Boston, or properties that we want to be considered problem properties by the City of Boston. Properties that have been vacant, abandoned, or problem properties for years. I'm obviously in my third year on the council, but some of these properties have been vacant or abandoned or problem properties for 10 or more years. And instead of focusing just on the small businesses, we said, let's come together and focus on all of these properties. I think what we'll probably focus on today is the city-owned parcels, but the conversation has to also address the privately owned parcels, because that is a big part of the problem. Some of the lots that are in District 4, largely Dorchester, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, and Rosendale, are city-owned. Some of them are privately owned. And I want to make sure that we, in talking about this issue, make that distinction, because that means we have different tools in our toolkit to address these properties. But also, if we don't have enough tools in the toolkit, what can we do to make sure that we do? I think this is timely, given the fact that we're having a conversation right now on short-term rentals, and the short-term rentals conversation is clearly regulating privately owned properties for a particular need and purpose. I think we need to be having a similar conversation for those properties that are privately owned, but are intentionally being left vacant, abandoned, and serve sometimes as a problem property because they are vacant and abandoned. And there was a recent article that came out about a study where folks have been looking at this problem in various municipalities and cities and towns across the country. And I thought they really summed it up well when they talk about what these properties do to a community. Not only do they create eyesores, they create public safety hazards, they are crime magnets. Abandoned houses represent a real financial drain on both the neighbors and the city at large. It creates neighborhood fragmentation and community isolation. And this idea, and I thought this was really critical, the sense no one cares and things aren't getting better. And these are powerful side effects that might be much harder for us to quantify. And looking at the hundreds of constituent services cases we handled in the first term, at the top of the list were these very issues. People talking about properties on their street that were either abandoned and there was criminal activity taking place, or squatters or something else, where the grass was overgrown, where it served as a blight on the neighborhood, or there were problem properties. And we were talking to Chris English, who's here representing the Problem Properties Task Force, about cases where tenants had been complaining, or residents and homeowners on that street had been complaining about the same property for years, and saying there are tenants in that building, there are tenants in that location that are a real problem for this community. And us working with problem properties to try to do something, and sometimes finding that challenging. In addition, these cases also covered folks who just called and said, I care about my neighborhood, and I don't want a home on my property, adjacent to my property, or in my community that is allowed to sit vacant and overgrown for a long period of time. Not only does it affect the community, but it also, of course, affects someone's property values. So the list is long in terms of constituent cases that we were dealing with respect to this issue. And so we got to a point in my office where we said, we don't want to keep dealing with these cases case by case. What are some policy changes or something else that we can do to incentivize owners who privately own these properties to do something, to also look at the city itself and look at our own parcels that might fall into some of these categories, and figure out what we can do with respect to these properties as well. How can, as Councilor O'Malley said, we activate these spaces? And they may be activated for different reasons. People around the world are finding that they can activate these spaces for community gardens or for something else. Obviously, it's a lot easier to do that if they're city-owned parcels. It's much more difficult if they are privately owned, but I think we also still need to have a conversation about what that might look like. Lastly, it might be leveraging fees. It might be requiring some sort of registration. I don't know, but this is a conversation, I hope, the first to establish what tools might exist, and to rely on your expertise to see what don't you have that we could help you get in your toolkit. And data collection. I got some data, and I look forward to going through it with from D&D related to the parcels that we're talking about in the city of Boston, and what's happening with those parcels. But when it comes to the privately owned parcels, that might be more challenging. But what can we do to get a better sense of the scope of the problem in our district, and also where it is happening the most? And one of the information documents that we received earlier today about the inactive city parcels, if you do a cursory glance through that list, it largely looks like Dorchester, Mattapan, and Roxbury. And that bothers me. And so I think, how can we make sure that when we're addressing this issue, we also are honest about where this has taken place and the importance of addressing it for those residents. Thank you for your partnership in this, and I thank you in advance for that. Thank you for your work so far in this. And Councilor O'Malley, thank you so much for your partnership. And Councilor Flynn, thank you for setting this hearing up so quickly.
Thank you, Council President Campbell. I'd also, for the record, like to acknowledge Councilor Flaherty and Councilor Siomo that are both present. At this time, I'd like to ask Councilor Janey if she'd like to have opening statement.
No statement. I'll reserve that for questions.
Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to emphasize the piece that Council President Campbell referenced on data collection. We've seen that at the forefront of the just cause eviction process. We've seen it on the forefront of our homeless count. We've talked about it with respect to the short-term rentals, and now we're obviously having a discussion around sort of commercial and residential vacancies. So that the data collection piece is paramount for us to be able to continue to work together, obviously identifying the mayor and his administration's priorities, as well as the council priorities, and trying to find ways to fund those necessary, results or fixes, if you will. So, and then engaging one another after we get the data, and engaging the community as to what they see what is appropriate, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, or in areas that feel that they're overdeveloped, a conversation around parking with respect to those vacant city-owned parcels and that are either developable or undevelopable. But it all, again, starts with that data collection. If we have the data, we have the evidence, we have the facts, then I think we could find solutions for that. So look forward to hearing the testimony, look forward to continued partnership and working together to try to solve this problem. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council Flaherty. Council Siomo? Thank you, Council Siomo. At this time, I'd like to recognize the city panel that is present. Economic Development Chief John Barrows, Neighborhood Development Chief Sheila Dillon, Inspectional Service Commissioner Buddy Christopher, Chris English, Problem Properties Task Force, and Commissioner of Assessing Gail Willett. Any of you like to start with opening statements? Mr. Barrows.
Mr. Chair, members of the council, we appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you about a very important matter. And the administration looks forward to continuing to work with you to learn more, to continue dialogue about how we can continue to improve our city and our neighborhoods and identify problem parts of our city and really begin to tackle the issue. Today I'm joined here by a number of folks. For the record, my name is John Barrows, Chief of Economic Development for the City of Boston. And I want to focus on a couple of different parts of the questions that have been put in front of us in this hearing. I want to recognize that we look forward to digging into the data with more time and getting back to you on the specifics as we hear questions today and sort of really understand what you guys want to discuss. But overall, Boston has seen in the last few years a real economic boom, and that has affected our vacancy rates on the commercial side, on the office side. We've seen a decline in vacancy overall. We do see more vacancy, though, in different parts of the city than we see in others. The overall office vacancy rate for the city of Boston is at 6.7% at this moment. And that's declined from 2014, when it was right under 11%. And in some neighborhoods, we see a higher rate than in other neighborhoods. It ranges from 1% or 1.4% all the way up to 8%. The specifics, when you start to look at our main street, which is a place that I typically have these conversations, and I feel like the impact is felt differently and feels that there's an overburden, even the numbers there are fairly good. Everything in the single digits. The highest Main Street vacancy rate that we have right now is in Grove Hall. That one is well above everything else. It's double everything else. It's double the next highest. It's at 15%. The next highest is Mattapan at 8.9%. And then it follows from that. The lowest vacancy rate in our main streets is Chinatown at below 1%. And then the second lowest would be JP at 1.4%, Central South, and then Alston at 1.5%. And it ranges all the way up to Mattapan at 15%, and I have them here, and I can share you these. I can share the numbers, and that's from a percentage standpoint, and the numbers speak for itself. But the reality is that there are buildings that have sat there for long periods of time, and that they impact our local economies. They impact quality of life. They impact many businesses, and some businesses more than others rely on clusters of businesses like their businesses to bring customers to have foot traffic and create the kind of vibrancy that they need to continue to be vibrant businesses. And so we do work with our small businesses, particularly in the Main Streets area, on this issue. We meet with landlords often. We have conversations with building owners so that we understand what's going on. And there are a variety of reasons why these storefronts are vacant. We, as you know, offer assistance to building owners on storefront improvements, restore, that specifically improves their assets to make sure that it's an incentive for them to bring in a business. We will then work with businesses that want to go into these locations and provide on-site assistance, business planning. We'll provide everything from cost management on energy efficiency, sustainability. We'll provide loans where needed to small businesses that are trying to occupy these spaces. And so we've been trying really hard to, A, stay on top of it, B, understand the local and individual situations of business owners, and then try to assist with the tools that we do have to make sure that these vacant properties are occupied and have vibrant businesses in them. Look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Wanted to give you a quick summary on vacancy in Boston and what we're looking at, and I want to turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Barrows, and thank you, Councilor Flynn, for holding this important hearing. It's a topic that we are think about quite a lot, and we're thinking about it more and more given the tightness of our real estate market. I do have some data that I could share with you. I don't think it's a complete set, and I think we should think about how to make it complete. But I just wanted to share with you what we do have. So since 1997, going way back, the city has every year conducted a survey of vacant and distressed properties, both residential and commercial. And so in 1997, when this started, there were 1,200 vacant and distressed properties in the city. We're just completing the 2017 data collection and analysis, and based on preliminary results, there's 405 properties that were identified as both vacant and distressed. But I want to say that owners of 265 of these, so the vast majority, provided evidence that they were renovating them or taking some action in the very near future. They were going to court to clean up title, renovation, like I said, so they were going to put them back in productive use. Owners of 140 properties that were vacant and distressed have not responded to our letters. And so those are the ones that will go on our website. We're just completing that list, and that will be available very soon. And we do this every year. So for a city this size, it's a good number. It's a reasonable number. But if you're living next to that building, it doesn't feel good if you're living on that street. So we do reach out to all the owners. We give our numbers and our cell phone numbers. Call us, and see if we can help you. But that's the number that we have in 2017. We have it by breakout, by commercial, residential, and we have it by neighborhood, so I can certainly make that available. What we don't have good data on, and we do use the American Community Survey, we don't have data on non-distressed vacant properties. The ghost units, the condominium developments that seem to be not necessarily 100% full. They do a survey every year, but it is just that. It is a survey. With a very, very high margin of error. They say that there's in 2016, there were 21,000 vacant units, although many of those are on the market to be rented, on the market to be sold, rented, but people haven't moved in yet, et cetera. There is one category that does, give us a wee bit of pause, and it's for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. And I would think that would be part of the Airbnb story, and that's 3,700. And then they have an other vacant category for 4,500. So I think as this discussion moves forward, we do need to figure out how to get at understanding, are there really viable properties that we know there are some commercial because we can see them. Residential, it's harder to determine. So how do we collect residential data on residential units that are not being offered, that may be vacant and are not being offered? I just want to say one thing for the City Council that has not received. We distributed, I think, to Councilor Campbell a few hours ago, and I apologize for the lateness of that. Information on our vacant lots. And currently we have 1,251 lots in the city of Boston. Many of those are 10 square feet, and some of them are certainly buildable. The good news here is the Walsh administration, as you know, because you're attending many of the meetings, we've worked very, very hard to get this number down. Our goal is not to own anything. And it should all be in the right hands, with the right community process. And to date, we have 875 of those lots either in active disposition, meaning community meetings are ongoing, we've designated developer, we're trying to figure out the financing, or they're under review, like the Grove. We're trying to figure out how to widen the streets and do eminent domain takings and encroachments. Some of them are very complicated, but there are 875 lots that we are working very hard on every day. There's another 108 of that 1,200 that are urban wilds. That we own them because there's not another good ownership structure right now. As a Conservation Commission frees up some of their capacity. And they have been very good about taking some of these, but they can't manage all of them. We do own many urban wilds. And then there's 268 inactive, and typically inactive, we know what they are. They're not our first choice lots because they've got ledge outcroppings or things. So we're going to get to those after we put out all the lots that are more developable or more easy to develop. They're contaminated. So until we get state money or we are always applying for federal cleanup money, until it's completely clean, we don't want to offer it to the public, or oftentimes neighborhoods, because they're feeling like we're before them too much. They've asked us to hold back on things until they can really, spend the time and think through with us what they want to see happen on those sites. So I will say with confidence, our staff know each and every lot, which I don't think has always been the case, and the vast majority are in process, and we look forward to the day where we have a handful of lots, and that we're working with tax title to get more inventory to put those back in productive use. So I'll close there. So those are the data points that I do have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And before we continue with the panel, I'd like to acknowledge that City Councilor Lydia Edwards has joined us, as has City Councilor Anissa Asabi George.
My comments until later.
Okay. Chris, would you like to?
I don't have an opening statement, but I'm happy to take any questions throughout the course of the hearing.
Okay. Okay, Councilor O'Malley, would you like to start with opening questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to also acknowledge from my team, Will Poff Webster, Jeanette Ebers, and Matt Donovan have done extraordinary research. Thank you all for this. Clearly, we're talking about a whole host of issues here, specifically commercial vacancies, high-end residential, then vacant lots for this first round of questioning, which I know the chair is going to keep me to a strict time limit. I want to focus on the commercial vacancy. And in all honesty, I want to thank all of you. You guys are doing great work, specifically Chief Barros and Chief Dillon. So I'm not trying to be critical here because I recognize that the number of vacancies has gone down in some cases dramatically. Yet, as it relates to certain commercial districts, we do seem to be seeing, I don't know if it's anecdotally, I think some studies have proven it, longer stays. There are two particular large-scale ones in my district that have been vacant, really anchored businesses that have been vacant for close to 10 years, one in West Roxbury, one in Jamaica Plain. Other cities are dealing with this. I'm not picking on Detroit, but there's sort of that has been an issue. It's getting better, but Detroit saw vacancy because of lack of interest. I don't think that's the case here. I think we have some, not all, but some landlords who are purposefully making the decision that by keeping something empty, they will be able to command a higher rent down the road. What are we doing about that, or what can we do about that?
So at this point.
Or am I wrong? I mean, John, you're in every neighborhood, you see this. Are you seeing some of these commercial empty spaces, and what do you think we should do about it?
Council, I agree with you. I think I can cite buildings
Sure.
in other parts of the city.
Yeah.
I think you and I have discussed them. I think I want to recognize that the buildings I know that you're citing and that I'm talking about, we're talking about decades of vacancy. So we're not talking about someone trying to turn over a space,
Yep.
right? We're talking about speculation
Yep.
in our neighborhoods. And so I want to acknowledge that that comes at a cost, to the city, to the neighborhood. It comes at a cost and typically brings blight and increases crime and a number of other issues. And so recognize the issue. I want to say our best tool right now is to incentivize investment.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that I think this is a good conversation, we should continue it, but our best tool right now is to incentivize investment and to have conversations to understand the end goal of owners. I think on some of the chronically vacant buildings, we have not seen a lot of success. And on the other ones where we have building owners who are responsive, trying to work with us, we have.
Yeah.
And we can get creative and we can help figure out. And they've pushed us to become more creative. And I think the administration is willing to work with them and really think about how to do that. I am at a loss, however, to really give you a answer to how right now we are able to get a landowner, a building owner, who pays their taxes and keeps a modest level of activity and cleanliness on their site to do anything with their property.
What's the administration's position on a potential vacancy fee? So I want to be clear, this isn't about being overly onerous, this isn't about being, sticking it to the landlord who's vacant after a long tenant moves out and is actively seeking. I'm talking about something 4, 5, 6, 10 years empty, assessing some fee based on square footage, based on length of vacancy. Would you guys be open to that?
I think we're happy to be invited and be part of the conversation. We think this is a really important conversation to have with the council. We very admittedly need to know more about what's out there and really look at this and look at data. We think, however, we share your frustration.
Yeah.
The mayor shares your calls from people to be able to do something. And so let's continue the conversation. Yeah. We're going to be very active with you and responsive in this.
And I want to be clear, this is the hearing order, this is the very first step, no ordinance has been drafted, and I don't think this is something that we can assess fees our way out of a problem.
Yep.
It's really a multifaceted approach. It's about collecting data, which I want to get to in a second. It's about seeing how the city can maybe expedite certain restrictions around creating a business or opening a business, which is something I know all of you are committed to. Right. But then, and we're going to hear from this in our second panel, Arlington has levied a fee. It's seen their vacancy rate. They're a much smaller town, but still it's a good sample size. Nearly cut in half, about 45% they've seen. Other cities are doing it at much higher rates, and it's a good tool to have. Another person from whom we'll be hearing in the second panel is the executive director of Rosendale Village Main Streets, who can talk about, and I think through some work with all of you, there was an empty space, supposed to be a new restaurant, fell through, activated it as a pop-up beer garden for a number of months. Tremendously successful. These are the type of ideas that I hope that we can engage going forward. So just last question to you, Chief Barros. 6.7% is the current office vacancy rate. Does that include commercial? Is that, when you say office, that includes, it's sort of an umbrella term for commercial?
Yes, that's the office occupancy rate, vacancy rate, excuse me.
And is that based on sort of MLS or real estate listings? In other words, do we draw our data from the entire building stock, or if there's something that's not on the market, would that be included as well?
So I have to dig a little deeper in sort of how we've defined this and what we're looking at. Right now, the source is some of our brokerage firms who we work with and continuously feed us this information.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question, and this we'll get to because my time's up for this round. There's an issue in West Roxbury where you had a vacant building, went through a very difficult neighborhood process, was able to secure approval and several variances, and it's now for sale. So some would argue that, well, this is unfair because things can take time. This has already gone through the process. The owner has made the determination to sell it after it's gone through the permitting process. Is that a common trend that we've seen? And are there any controls that we have over that, or is it?
I can't speak to trends,
Yeah.
but it is something that we do see in the marketplace. So there are developers or those who come in and permit a site and then sell it. I could try to figure out numbers or trends and whether it's increasing, decreasing, but my my gut tells me in a very hot market that we continue to see people who permit and then sell their assets.
And I would just say, and this is where, I'm as free market of economist as the next guy, or as many of the next people, but this is where it affects others. A landlord has every right to, determine what his or her bottom line is in terms of raising money, in terms of making money. It's a free market, it's a free economy, but this is where it starts to affect the neighborhoods, where businesses see up to a 25% decrease because of these vacancies, where we're seeing more residential units built, yet it's not necessarily alleviating what we need to do in terms of prices. It is affecting us all. So just as landlords have every right to look out for their bottom line, as a city councilor, I have every right to look out for the bottom line of our neighborhoods.
Councilor,
Thank
I'd
you.
just like to add.
Yes, please.
We're starting to see, over the past 2 years, a lot of prospecting on buildings. People will come to us, they have a business model that they want to implement. The first question they usually ask us is, where's the best place to put this? And we can't really assist them with that, and it's more from our point of view is, give us a selection of a place and we can tell you what the procedure is to go through with it. We've worked very hard, and I've worked with John on some of the buildings that were problems to see if there was something that we could do to incentivize the owner to take that next step to turn it into a more of a viable business. But we don't see a lot of flipping on the business end of getting a permit in place and then flipping it over, because in our world, when the owner changes, the regulations have to be revisited.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Councilor Campbell?
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. And I sort of see this as three buckets that I'll focus on, and because I want to make sure that my colleagues have time, I won't go into all three buckets. But one is the data collection piece. The second is these incentives to do something. And then the third is what other possible solutions might be out there. So for just first focusing on the data collection piece, and before we get to the residential numbers, Chief, that you shared, Chief Barrows, so it is disturbing when you look at the vacancy rates, particularly for Grove Hall, Mattapan, in contrast to some of the downtown neighborhoods, including Chinatown. Sure. I think this is what people see and what frustrates them, and why they say nothing happens in these neighborhoods, and I put that in quotes. It's because they look at these numbers, or they see the visible properties that are vacant and that are disturbing. So I think as we talk about and get to the incentives in terms of resolving vacancies, as we talk about possible solutions, I understand that some of this will be testing out new ideas or testing out ideas from other municipalities or other communities. Right. I always believe in the idea of testing things out and running a pilot or whatever else. And maybe you try it in these neighborhoods, you start with those places that have the highest vacancy rates. And I imagine with these properties that are vacant, the numbers that you just shared, or these offices that are vacant, they've been vacant for maybe for a long time. So one of the questions I have on just the data piece is the only data available, is it from the brokerage firms, and is it us calling them? Do they send it to us on a regular basis? Is there some relationship? And are they the only ones that we can get this data from? And then my sort of last question related to that, who's giving us the information? When do we get the information? Is I'm assuming all of these office spaces are spaces that are owned by a private owner, not by us.
Right, thank you very much. Madam President. So I just want to, I've got two sets of information here from different sources, and I just want to call them out a little bit. Oh, I share your quest to improve our data and get more data. For what I have now, the office vacancy rates are coming from the brokerage firms. For our neighborhoods, when I quoted the Mattapan number and the neighborhood numbers, I have them, they're from our main streets. And so when I look at the main streets numbers, those are numbers that we are being reported by typically the directors of our main streets and what they're seeing in their area, in their main streets area. And so the Mattapan number of 15.2%, which is in fact an outlier.
Oh, that's
I mean, it's
Grove
really
Hall,
big.
right? 15.
Sorry.
Yep.
Grove Hall is coming from the Grove Hall main streets. The same with the Mattapan of 8.9. Ownership. We, as you know, we do not own a lot in our main streets outside of city public buildings. Libraries are typically what we own in the main streets areas. We are, however, the mayor has asked us, and we launched after Imagine Boston 2030, when residents were telling us that we needed to be more active in the main streets and be more active in the real estate space. We did launch a pilot in Upham's Corner. And so the city then assembled some property in Upham's Corner, and we own some buildings in Upham's Corner that we are going to activate. And for the first time, and we look forward to working with you on this because it won't be easy, following the council's lead, in fact, the mayor's responding to the call by the council to look at mixed-use libraries. And so we're going to look at the mixed-use library in Upham's Corner that will have both potentially housing on top of the library to create an affordable condition for housing to be built. And then we will look at small business space on the storefront or the street front of the library to create
No, I
affordable
mean, I
commercial
think
space.
those are respectfully possible solutions, right?
Yes,
and I have to give
possible
Councilor
solutions.
Baker, he's not here, some of the credit because he's always talking about Fields Corner,
Yep.
the library, housing on top. And I'm like,
Right.
you go for that, Frank. And I agree.
Yeah.
I share Fields Corner with him. But going back to the data piece, so some of these numbers, whether it's from main streets to brokerage firms, are privately owned, and some include some city-owned commercial lots that are currently vacant.
So on the lots, very different, right? And so
I mean, commercial offices, sorry.
no, we own. I can probably by hand talk to you about the buildings that we own that have vacant commercial retail space, and typically they're vacant because the neighborhood has asked us to work with them to get a certain type of business. So, for instance, the bowling building. The bowling building right now has 2 vacant spots, and one, the lease is being negotiated, and we'll have hopefully a live jazz restaurant on the front corner of the 7,800 square feet retail space in the bowling building. And the other one is a much smaller location that was vacated by Haley House. We are very active in talking to the neighbors about what they want to see there, and they've asked us to hold that second location until we can have more liquor license allocation to the neighborhood.
So I think what would be helpful is, and for everyone, including people who aren't here, some colleagues aren't here, is where do we get the information to determine our vacant commercial properties? How they give that information to us? Is it in the timing in which we receive that? Is it required? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Does it cover privately owned and city-owned both? And then what those lots are. So sort of breaking that out, I think, would be really helpful. Almost similar to sort of the paperwork that you sent us, Chief Dillon. And then going to this information you sent, Chief, and I'll end with this, but I'm sure everyone cares about this. It would be helpful to have so there's a lot of numbers that were, the surveys that you cited, the 875 that are active, I'm sorry, starting with 1997.
Oh.
This is a survey of
Right. So,
By whom and for what?
so staff go out
Yep.
and they drive up and down streets. And they also get information from water and sewer, what has been turned off, who owns back taxes. There's a whole methodology on where they really focus. And then they look at last year's survey to sort of track progress. But really, it is a building-by-building street survey that we do every year to get a list of vacant and distressed properties.
And so information related to that survey for each year is available for us to
Yes,
look at?
be glad to get that to you by neighborhood. Yes.
And it tells us the total number of what we think might be vacant.
Yes.
Probably an underestimate of what probably is the case because
Right.
it's such a hard way
Right.
to.
Well, what I've said in earlier, and I think this is another problem, but I don't know how to count it, is what's not distressed and vacant. Who has residential units or commercial units that look good? There's no distress, that's there. We all know a building, when we see a distressed building, we know what it is. We don't count vacant buildings. So in the residential, it'd be very, very hard to determine what is vacant. I guess on a retail, you could much more easily, but we don't count those because we're not working on that problem right now, but.
Okay, I'm going to save my questions for the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Campbell. Councilor Janey?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and certainly want to say thank you to the sponsors of this important hearing order. This is a huge issue. Certainly in my district, I share a lot of the concerns that Councilor Campbell already raised around the vacancy rates in certain neighborhoods, whether we're talking about commercial, whether we're talking about housing, whether we're talking about empty lots. So I think this is a very timely, important discussion, very interested in how we collect data, what data we currently have. I'm very, very interested in pursuing some sort of fee or tax structure that could help address this. I've heard from people who have an empty lot who say that it's cheaper to just pay the fine than to actually maintain the lot. And that, I think, is quite disrespectful for the residents and our neighborhoods, that they would have to put up with such blight and deal with that because we have bad players who want to be bad neighbors. So thank you. I want to come back to some of the properties in my district. So there are some properties like the Hotel Alexandra, which has a storefront on the ground floor, but has been vacant for as long as I can remember. I'm not sure I ever remember the hotel in my lifetime. So is that on your radar? And what is happening with that? I've heard over time that, perhaps someone's interested in buying, then the deal falls through. What is happening there? And even the commercial space on the ground floor could use some sort of a facelift, but I'm not sure that it is considered part of either the Dudley Main Street or the Washington Gateway Main. It's just kind of lost there in the middle. Do either of you have any updates on that piece of property?
Councilor, thank you for the question. Yes, I am not old enough to remember a hotel there. It is a beautiful building.
It's gorgeous.
However, with great architectural features, and we can only wish to see it maybe activated again in our lifetime. However, it is one of those properties that they pay their taxes. There are active businesses on that front floor, the first floor, and run that street front. And we've engaged them in conversations. In fact, very recently we hosted a development team that had approached them to buy the property. At this point, Councilor, the city feels that what we were presented was out of scale for what the neighborhood has said to us that they would be willing to support. Mm-hmm. And part of that is the development team felt the acquisition price had to be sustained by a pretty massive development. And so without rendering an official city decision, we often meet with development teams and give them a feel for location, for the type of thing that they're trying to present, and we'll say to them, you know, whether we've heard from the neighborhood on those topics, on the scale, on program, and that scale was a little bit much,
Right.
maybe 3 times any building in that area.
Right, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because that brings me to my next point. What I have found, certainly in Roxbury, and I'm sure in other parts of the city, that people are holding on to properties hoping for some big payday, whether it's higher rents that they can charge or to sell the property outright. And in the interim, people are forced to deal with the blight. And so I can just hold on to this. There is an empty lot on the corner of Warren Street and St. James that has been, there used to be a church, I do remember the original church, I'm old enough to remember that, but that church has been gone for decades now. And you have people who look at that property and say, yes, we'd like to buy it, or maybe we've bought it, and now we have to develop it. And their plans are so massive, with so much density, none of the neighbors like it, but then they're saying the only way we can do it and make the numbers work is to do this big building. And so neighbors are being forced to either live with the blight of the empty lot for another couple of decades, or to have some monstrosity of a building that nobody wants. And it's because people are allowed to sit on these vacant lots, on these vacant buildings, and I just find it very problematic. Coming back to Dudley, so I appreciate the movement that's happening with bowling. You know, the corner storefront has been empty since the Ferdinand was developed and revitalized, and so it's great to see that there's some movement there. But there are all of these other empty storefronts along, you know, Washington Street. And do you have a sense of, is the issue high? Are we collecting data to know if it's the issue is high rent? Are people just holding out for that payday? What I hear is that people are waiting for whatever this new day is going to look like, in terms of, you know, people thought that the bowling building, Ferdinand's getting done, that's going to be the savior of Dudley Square and Roxbury. And I don't necessarily look for outsiders to come in and save our communities. I think we've got a lot of talent, a lot of good, strong businesses, but it is very concerning to see the number of empty storefronts in Dudley. I was surprised that, I don't know where it fits on your Main Street's numbers, you didn't mention it, but I was just wondering if you had a sense of, is it too high rents for businesses that want to come? Is it that people are just sitting on it waiting for the day when they think it will be profitable to either rent it out or to sell it? What is your sense of what's happening?
Great question, Constance. I do want to, there are some complexities, and we look at this all the time, and part of the complexity is in ownership. So the former hotel you just mentioned on Washington Street is in fact, is owned by an institution, and they can sit, right? It's a pretty wealthy church. You know, what you and I think is long for them is very short. The vacancy in Dudley has a hodgepodge of ownership. The one that, there's a set of maybe 4 empty storefronts right in front of the bowling building next to where that restaurant's going. In research, we found that that's owned by a REIT.
Owned by who?
It's owned by a portfolio of properties that people buy as part of an investment, right? And so there are different REITs that own different types of properties. For example, the building that we bought in Upham's Corner as a city was owned by a REIT that owns bank properties. And so the city, in doing its due diligence, found that the REIT was about to close, dissolve, and they were willing to sell. We put our hands up, but typically that doesn't happen. And the one in Dudley, that's not happening, in fact. And what the REITs do is they own it, and every REIT has a different investment style. This REIT owns it and is owning it as more of a speculative sort of, you know, approach, right, for the, in fact, value of the property and what's happening in the local market versus the revenues that would come from renting. So you've got empty storefronts. There are a couple of families who own and have owned for a long time in Dudley that we're talking to see if they can use more financing to help them invest in their current buildings. And we've had 2 meetings now with current local ownership, owners that own buildings in Dudley, to see how the city can help match capital needs with their investment sort of goals. So there's a series of different types of ownership models. Some of them are generational owners in Dudley. Others are more nuanced. They're new, they're coming in, they're trying to figure out what's going on. The Dudley small office space right now is renting between, the new ones, renovated, renting between $25 and $30. And it takes out a lot of the folks who are currently in Dudley. And the small business space is trying to match the office numbers.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So the $25 to $30 square foot, per square foot, how does that compare to other commercial districts throughout the city? Other main streets?
So in other commercial, some other commercial
Not including
districts,
downtown.
Yeah,
but
right, so I was gonna say, right,
ones.
it's very affordable.
The neighborhood ones.
To the neighborhood ones, so, you can't get that in Mattapan, you can't get that in Upham's Corner down the street, you can't get that in a lot of places, but in fact, in other places, that's good, right? It's not bad. All right, in other places, you're seeing 30 to 40.
I'd be interested in having that data. I have additional questions, but I want to be mindful that I have other colleagues here who have
got you.
some questions.
And if
I'd
I
be
get too much in
interested
the weeds, just stop me. And,
Yeah, I'd be interested just in terms of follow-up if you could get that information to me about the rents.
Thank you, Councilor
Mr.
Janey.
Chair.
Councilor Flaherty?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Probably best to Sheila, because I have the report here, the REMS inventory study. Can you just take me through this, basically 4 categories: planning, research, under consideration, active disposition, on hold, and inactive, and there's a total of 1,251 properties. Sure. Can you just kind of take me through each one of those categories? What does it mean to be inactive? What does it mean to be on hold? And I guess what I'm looking for is, we want to make sure that we're as fully transparent as possible, so we want notice to abutters and making sure that the process is fair and open. We also want a degree of predictability for the community, as also for those that have the opportunity maybe to acquire these properties as to what they can and what they cannot do. Probably to Councilor Janey's point that there might be some folks that are just out there sitting on things, holding back, thinking that, it's just sitting on a gold mine, and quite frankly, that's quite not how it works. But and also defined start and a defined finish to the process, so that we can try to transition these parcels as quickly and kind of, I guess, put them to work, if you will, or put them to good use in the community. Again, it could be a residential unit, it could be a commercial unit, it could be open space, it could be a parking lot for neighborhoods that need some additional parking. So, but if you can just maybe give me a sense as to what does it mean to be in each one of those categories,
Sure.
that'd be great.
Sure, my pleasure, Counselor. So first is planning, research, under consideration, and that number is large, but it's really mainly made up of 3 areas of the city. It's where so the first thing we do when we decide we want to dispose of these parcels, or we start looking at the environmental conditions, we start understanding the neighborhood, zoning, what are the limitations, what are the assets, what are the difficulties with a particular site, and we start doing a lot of internal analysis. Some of that, and for some of you know, we're building a lot of new homes in the city on smaller lots, and so part of that work is looking at the architectural features of a neighborhood and the affordability and all of that. So that's where we were doing, and so that category is where we're doing a lot of research. Much of that 458 is made up of the Grove, which we've owned for decades. And so I said, we're going to dispose of the Grove. We're going to do it. It's going to be great. And come to find out, the way that the roads were laid out are so narrow you couldn't get a fire truck down them. So now we're looking at over 200 lots. They're very, very narrow. They must have been designated or designed in the turn of the century for row houses. So now we're looking at, okay, to widen the roads, we'd have to do eminent domain takings and things. So we're hiring an outside person to really help us think that through. But that's kind of the work we're doing behind the scenes before we're going out to community and saying, we're ready to have a conversation about disposition. Active disposition means that we've done our homework and we are now working with the community. And we are going out and we're saying, these are the sites we'd like to dispose of. You've all been to these meetings. This is our best thinking on this. We'd like to hear from you. And I will say there's very few processes, well, there's a few, but there's very few processes right now that are contentious. We're talking to neighborhoods about design, density, affordability levels, informing them what we know about the parcels. Are they contaminated? What would it take to clean them up? That kind of thing. And so we track them very closely. We meet internally every 2 weeks. Staff have got to make progress on those parcels or they're in the hot seat. And so I know exactly using data where they all are. 128 are in community process, 18 are in RFPs right now, 43 RFPs issued, and so on and so on. Some of the delay in this category is if a community, and many do, really want to see our sites used to create affordable housing, then they have to go around and get the resources to do that. So they're coming to us, they're coming to the state, they're coming to the federal government, they're going to foundations, and that can take a couple of years, but we're patient. We work with the community, we designate a developer, and then it is their responsibility within a certain amount of time to line up the resources to get into construction. So we have 417 parcels right now in that category that are actively being worked on with the community or in developers. On hold, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of those are urban wilds, and we just don't have a good home for those. Those are sites that we would never build on. They're part of our tree canopy. Communities love them. We maintain them because they never get free of trash or anything, but those are ones we'd probably never develop. So the vast majority are urban wilds. And then we have an inactive category. We either haven't gotten to it yet, just because we're trying to move the 800 that I mentioned, or neighborhoods have asked us to put them on hold. They've got ledge, or they're very contaminated, and we're trying to get the federal funds and state funds to clean them up.
Okay. And then from the notice to abutter perspective, I assume that if you're living next door or across the street or around the corner, folks may have an interest, and they probably inquire pretty regularly as to, hey, what's going on with this parcel? 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 What's happening with that parcel? What's going on with this parcel? So it goes on for a long time.
It does.
So I don't know what that line of communication is when they reach out to your department, and who's communicating back to the folks that are saying it's inactive, it's on hold, it's active disposition. But more importantly, when we're ready to go, we're notifying the direct abutters and folks in that neighborhood that it's open and available, and put a bid in.
Anyone who calls or expresses an interest, and sometimes it's not our priority, but it is theirs, and we do, if we hear from a lot of people, we do try to elevate those parcels and get them into the active disposition category. We take very good information on who's calling. We have a couple of people that do, that really is their task. And then when there's any movement, they have their email addresses or phone numbers and reach out to them directly. It's good. It's good. Once in a while, someone will say, I didn't hear, but they may have moved, et cetera. I think one of our biggest challenges is that years ago, the city used to make a lot of land available for open space, side yards, and they were big lots. They were big sites. 6,000, 7,000 square feet, and people still would like to see that happen. But if we have very beautiful flat lots right now, we may be able to give them a piece of it, but we really need our lots to develop new housing, contextual, tasteful, nice architecture, good affordability levels. But we no longer can sell very large parcels. The city's just not big enough. We need housing. But we do try to work with them to make sure that if they need a driveway or they need an easement or they need a piece of the lot, that we're accommodating.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Chief.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Council Flaherty. Council Siomo?
Hi, thank you. I was just going to follow up on the 405 properties that were surveyed. Did you say they were all Main Streets districts?
Oh, no. There's just parcels throughout the city.
Okay.
We have very few sites. We have a few pieces of land in Main Street districts, but very few.
Okay. No, the reason I bring that up is for more than 10 years, and I want to recognize Ally Carter, our former Brighton Main Streets director. There were two very prominent properties, commercial retail properties, one right on Market, Chestnut Hill. Used to be Rourke's Pharmacy, kind of a landmark. Recently has a tenant. What happened was Kabloom was in there, National Retail. They went out of business in a couple of years, but they had like a 10-year lease. So the property owner is getting rent. How many of the potential 405 are actually leased that, the landlord is getting the best of both worlds, no tenants, but getting rent every month for possibly 10 years. And not just that space, but next to Winship Spa, also a prominent location across from the police station, recently got Cafe Nero. So it's kind of ironic that I came here with those two places in mind, and now they're actually tenanted, so.
Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, no, I know it happens. We don't have any data on that. We'd have to really think about how to maybe get data.
Right, I mean, I think that, I think it's, something to pursue. And one of the things that was great about having Main Streets is those particular properties actually had, what's that stuff that you put on the windows rather than just paper bag stuff, material? Yeah, decals, and so it didn't look vacant, or as vacant as it could, and it didn't certainly look blighted. And I think, there should be a distinction. I'm also thinking of Charlesview. Charlesview, Chief Dillon, great housing development that we opened to low-income folks just 3-4 years ago now. There's still vacant retail space there. I don't know if they're just asking too much rent, but literally it's been vacant on Western Ave for years again. So I think it's a complex problem, but I also think there should be a distinction. If somebody's getting rent, keeping their property up, but they're getting rent, it's leased, they really may not even have the right to sublet it, if you will.
Right.
Just throwing that out there.
I didn't know that Charlesview still had some vacant spaces, so I will check on with the owner on that and what their process has been and what the rents are. I will get back to you on that. I'm unhappy to hear that as well.
Yeah, and the thing is that there's numerous other retail establishments popping up, mostly Harvard-owned property. Trader Joe's, Our Father's Deli. There's a lot of good stuff happening on Western Ave, and it just doesn't seem to be moving down that end where the people are.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes and I'm not going to speak for the BPDA, certainly Chief Barrows can, but sometimes neighborhoods will say we want commercial on the first floor and residential above, and sometimes I think we create too much commercial, especially if there's not enough foot traffic. So I think we have to be mindful of that. But I will check on Charlesview.
Thank you, appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. We will do another round of questions. Councilor O'Malley, would you like to start?
How many minutes this time, Mr. Chairman, are you giving us?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, I like it. Okay, very briefly, because I do want to get to our second panel. In 2008, which I don't know, maybe, you were here in 2008, Councilor Siomo, and I think Sheila may have been. There was the vacant property and foreclosure ordinance that Mayor Menino, I believe, sponsored, the council passed.
I wasn't.
Yeah, I wasn't either. So in 2008, there was, I'm not a lawyer, but I know to always ask the questions I know the answer to. So in 2008, the Mayor Menino authored and the City Council passed a vacant property and foreclosure ordinance which created a $100 registration fee for residential.
It was Rob Consalvo.
It was Councilor Consalvo, thank you.
Yes.
Give him credit.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
This doesn't count against my 3 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So, but that is for residential units, not commercial, correct?
I'd have to go back and reread it.
The answer is yes, it's
Yes, okay,
residential,
yes.
not commercial. Can we add commercial Just to have, the purpose that I'm asking here is that I feel like we may have some tools on the books. And rather than reinventing the wheel, although there are other things I'd like to do, but at a minimum, I think that we need to see about including, and it may take an act of this body, commercial units for the vacant property and foreclosure ordinance. Now, that was done a little bit differently. It was the foreclosure crisis. It was to sort of get ahead of things, which you guys have done so well, Sheila. But this is, again, is a little bit differently, so we can have a master list. Because I would argue, as we talk about data collection, while this is all helpful, you have a certain list. DND has a list. BFD has a list. ISD has a list. I'd rather have a more comprehensive way to address it. So I guess that would be the first one. And then secondly, and to you, Commissioner, as it relates to assessing, when we've got, so basically there are two property tax rates, correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, not excluding different circumstances, but you pay property taxes on your home. If you live there and claim the residential exemption, it's usually probably 30 to 40% less than if you didn't have that. And those are basically the two main categories. Now, Chief Dillon, in an earlier budget hearing, I believe you had a statistic which floored me that I think it's Millennium Tower, 3/4 or 2/3 of the residences there don't employ the residential exemption.
I didn't have that, I'm sorry.
You didn't have that?
It wasn't
Does
me.
that
It
sound
might have been assessing.
It may have been.
I don't think we did talk about it, but yes, I think those numbers are pretty accurate.
An overwhelming majority. So is there any way to, so obviously these are investments. This is a very safe investment if you can afford it. The property value will appreciate. It's less volatile than the stock market. There's a lot of foreign investors, and again, that's everyone's God-given right. But I wonder has there been any conversation about exerting an additional fee on top of that? Because we are paying for it with a paucity of housing stock. We are paying for it in the business sense with other local businesses which are hindered for growth. Do you know if assessing has looked at ways to sort of address, foreign investment for our housing?
No, we haven't. I mean, we're mainly focused on value. Anything beyond what would be a market value is something that we couldn't add on to the tax bill. I think the other thing is, although you have these foreign investors, they're also not pulling any city services. So they're not putting kids in school, they're not putting trash out, they're not using any city services. So I don't think it's a total loss on not having people living in these units either.
Well, I appreciate that. I would say it, and this is less about those units, but the vacant. There was a fire at a vacant unit in West Roxbury where kids were going. So there is a cost that even in action and lack of people, there is a cost there. And if we don't dictate tax policy based on children going to school or not, or other things, or how much trash you throw out. So I appreciate the point, but I do think that it's a conversation we should have at subsequent working sessions from this. So that's all for this round, because I do want to hear from our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Council President Andrea Campbell.
Thank you. Just following up on the 2008 ordinance, obviously that's still in the books. Who is doing anything with that when it comes to vacant and foreclosed lots? Are we still requiring registration, still requiring a fee, tracking those units? Yeah. Do you want? Those are foreclosures, right? And if not, I think it's.
We have the foreclosure program that we're aware of. I'm not aware of it being the vacancy program. That's something that I'll definitely look into today and get back to the council. But to my awareness, the answer is no, that it's all about the foreclosure, and we do keep a list of that.
So that might be a tool in the toolkit, one, seeing how we might be able to activate that, and then pull in the small business properties.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about that subsequently. Thank you, Commissioner. And then in terms of data collection, have we thought about partnering with some of the local universities? So I know, for example, there are some MIT students here somewhere who, oh, they're back there, hello, who are working on this very issue and are focused on this and wanting to look at different districts. I am talking with some Wentworth students who are interested in this. So just curious if the administration is talking to universities, and if not, I think that's another way for us to give, I think maybe the human capital research and whatever else we don't have to assist with some of this data collection.
I would welcome it. We always have very, very smart, we're surrounded by very, very wonderful colleges and universities, and we always have a lot working on various projects, so this might be a very good project. Yeah.
And I think it would be great, because even if it's going to take more time, obviously, with the privately owned properties. It might be easier with more commercial spaces because of what the commercial spaces need to operate, to open. But for the city-owned lists, that we currently, or the city-owned parcels, particularly those that are inactive, but we could be doing something with, right? This list.
I think the inactive ones, I do think we have a handle on pretty much every parcel. I mean, I think if we had staff here, they'd say, oh, that has an outcropping, that has, whatever, contamination. I feel like we know our property better, but we've been using colleges and universities every summer to start doing build-out scenarios. I mean, a lot of the architectural schools. So we do use colleges and universities to help us, but
no, and it could be, so where I was going with that was for the city-owned parcels, obviously we have data. I'd like to see it centralized in some place. And sort of more information attached to it. So for example, all of this data is very useful, but when you pull out the inactive information, I would love a resident in my district to be able to go on the City of Boston's website, someplace that is transparent and open, to go through and to find out all of the residential lots that are city-owned. We'll start with the place, what we have, and to see where it is, to see what's happening with it. If it's contamination, how long it's been vacant, what the city is doing with respect to that. It might be seeking funding for contamination. A real breakdown and breakout in a sort of a master or central location where someone from the outside could easily get this information. And I think where the universities might also be useful is expanding this to include those lots and parcels that we know to be vacant, but that are privately owned and may require some more digging and research. And then putting that in a centralized place. But I do think in the short term, there's something we can do with the data we have on the city parcels that are vacant in a way that makes that list and that information transparent. And then we go to, okay, then how do we address the solutions or possible activation, pop-ups, whatever else. But right now, it doesn't live anywhere.
It is on our website.
Okay.
I need to go back, and I would encourage, I'll work with your staff, Counselor, to see if...
How does it present on the website?
I mean, everything can always be improved, but it's the information is there, it's interactive, you can look at where we are in the disposition process. I don't know if all the inactives are there, I don't know if there's the descriptions that you're describing, so everything can always be enhanced and improved, but we worked really hard over the last couple of years to be more transparent and give out information, but I'd be glad to work with your staff and colleges and universities to see if it can't be more, even improved. But it is
more
there.
user-friendly, and I think there's some information that isn't there, and I know that because we were
Looking
emailing to find it. But we know it exists, so how do we create a site or scenario that's user-friendly, that's welcoming, that people say, oh, okay, and then where we are with respect to what we're doing for those parcels.
Great.
And then lastly, just focusing on, and obviously we're going to have another conversation about this, but just focusing on the problem properties. And Chris, I want to pull you in because this is sometimes just a headache. And these are properties where I can go in a neighborhood, and I'll bring up Philbrook, for example, in the Rosendale section of my district. And it gets really frustrating to tell those residents, I'm so sorry, but there's little we can do. So I think, one, how often does the Problem Properties Task Force meet? Do you do quarterly reporting? There's an expectation in the ordinance and policy that there's a quarterly report that comes out. I don't know if we've seen it. And then how do we maintain better records that are more public facing so that, for example, at the Codman Square meeting the other night, we've been trying to get a property on the Problem Properties Task Force list. I email you, but no one could go on anywhere to say, oh, it actually is listed as problem properties, but then what's the next step? What does listing it mean? Are we assessing, what pieces of the problem property task force are we actually implementing with respect to that property now that it's listed? So I'd love for you to answer a few of those questions.
So we meet monthly. It's a collection of at least 14 different city agencies, from inspectional services, pretty much most of the folks at this table, police, fire, code enforcement, and review all of the properties that are actively either on our list or under investigation.
These are private meetings, but
Right, correct.
could they be public facing? Has that ever been considered? I mean, not necessarily for people to sort of chime in, like we have our council meetings. You can't testify during council meetings, but you can come and listen, right?
They're pretty
Just a
intimate
question.
meetings. And we do discuss information about certain properties and that would not necessarily be public information, based on ownership or details of criminal activity that's happening there. So there is some sensitivity to it. But as far as creating sort of more public-facing repository for it, we are working on getting our list uploaded to the city's website with details on what's designated, what's been removed, who owns it, and how long it's been on the way. So that's ongoing work. Hopefully, we'll have that done shortly. So.
And do we do quarterly reports as sort of mandated by the policy?
We have done quarterly reports in the past. I believe we are working on reorganizing how those reports are presented to both the council and the public as well. But I'd be happy to follow up with you on those.
Okay. Do you know when the last report was?
Off the top of my head, I don't know the date, no.
Okay. I'd love to know that, and I think we got to get back to reporting in some way. So even if the meetings, for example, it's not the best way. The best way is not to have it public. Okay, I think we want to maybe talk through what might be able to be public. But I think a report out in some way is very helpful, because one of the biggest things I find that's really difficult is when we do advocate with our residents, and some of whom come forward not happily. I mean, you're sort of reporting on the person down the street, and sometimes it can be ugly for those constituents, but they come forward because they care about their community and want to make a difference. And they, by that point, have already worked with ISD, who sent out inspectors, and they're trying to do the same thing. So the next step is to look at the Problem Properties Task Force. Usually the police are also pulled in, or D&D. And how hard it is to get a property designated as problem property just seems too hard, too difficult. And then when it is, folks want to know, well, then now what? Nothing's changed now that it's listed. So I'd love for us to, one, get back to quarterly reporting in some way, thinking about a public space where people can engage with the task force or someone who leads the task force in some way, to offer their ideas. And then maybe thinking about, is the Problem Properties Task Force rules and regulations and policies enough to handle the issue? And if not, what do we need to do as a council or as a body to complement your efforts, or to give you more tools to do something with these properties that folks have been complaining about for a really long time, and nothing seems to be changing from their position and their perspective. So I'll look forward to continuing that conversation too. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Council President Campbell. Councilor Janey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I just want to also highlight the residential pieces and say thank you to you, Commissioner. There are several problem properties, as Councilor Campbell has already noted. I had a call recently about a property on Kenilworth Street, 22 Kenilworth, the door being ajar. What we know is that problem properties can be overrun with animals, with squatters who are using drugs and other things. There was one on Burton Avenue in Roxbury, and immediate response to secure the building. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And just for clarity, when we're talking about problem properties, we're not just talking about vacant buildings. We are talking about properties who have had several complaints against them, maybe the police have been called, et cetera. Yes?
That's correct.
Okay.
The vast majority of properties are actually occupied.
Wonderful. And are you keeping that data by neighborhood?
Yes.
Okay, I'd be interested in that. When we're talking about the lots that are contaminated, where are they? So we have a number. Do we also have that by neighborhood?
I can get that to you. It's not in the data that I provided to Councilor Campbell, but they are throughout the city, the ones that we own, and I'd be glad to give you a list. Now, most lots would have some contamination if a house was there and had lead paint, but that's superficial. We can take care of that during construction. I think you're interested in the larger contaminated sites.
And I'm wondering what is happening, and not because I want to see them then disposed and developed, but because I'm sure that residents, children, or seniors, no one wants to live near a lot that is contaminated. And I'm sure many of our residents don't even know if they're living near that. And I just see it as a public safety issue.
Right. I'll get you the list of the ones that I think are serious. We do have a handle. We're working with the state. We've done all the proper reporting, but I'd be glad to get you that list.
Okay. And on, back to residential units, commercial units, when we're looking at the high-end luxury, do we have a sense of how many are out there? Do we know where they are?
Vacancies, you mean?
Yes.
No, we don't.
We're not
I don't know of a way to collect information on vacant luxury units.
Yeah. Is it through like MLS, or we just haven't figured that out yet?
Because if right, for sale or for rent, you could I guess you could get those if they were put on MLS or they're using the typical avenues to rent or sell, but the ones that have been sold and are vacant, I don't know how we would get those.
Mm-hmm. What about the commercial spots that don't kind of fall within a main streets? So we talked earlier about kind of the hotel at the corner of Mass Ave, that building at Mass Ave in Washington, not really falling into Dudley, not really falling into Washington, Maine. Do we have a sense of how many commercial spaces are vacant that are not going to be counted in those that data that you provided earlier?
So we do have a sense for vacancy for commercial properties, I think.
Whether or not they're main streets or not?
Right.
Okay.
And I think the one that eludes us, Councilor Siomo raised, which is the property that is leased, except the business, so the business has a 10-year lease. Year 3, they go out of business, they leave the property stays vacant, but it's still under lease, and so the owner decides they're just going to continue to keep it empty. And they're going to collect the rent anyways.
So if you have that by neighborhood, I'm also interested in that. And then I don't think Councilor Edwards had a chance, so I'll yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Janey. Councilor Edwards?
Thank you, and I apologize for having to be in and out. I want to just follow up on a lot of the data point questions that I know people have probably already asked, but one suggestion, because I think this really is a matter of trying to find where they are. And Commissioner, would having a question on the rental registry for landlords that have to comply, a question that actually said, is the unit vacant or not? Would that be helpful if people had to actually identify whether the units are vacant?
The information will be based on an annual
Right.
application. I don't see it as a problem to do that, but then you need more of a follow-up. So
True.
at the date of registration, it's vacant, but then next month it gets rented. So how valuable would that data be to us, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, well, if you saw that someone had years of vacancy, for example, it might be helpful. So you can see so that's just one point of data that we can maybe start to collect to help us really, and this is, I know that a lot of the hearing has been about commercial properties, but when it comes to the residential ones where we're finding folks are not renting out their units, not using, and we will know if they're using short-term rental, thank goodness, because one day we'll have a registry that's up that will see that. But when, if we see consistently every single year this person is not renting out, that might be something that we can start to collect. And then I just wanted to also follow up on, so in East Boston, we have a particular property that all of us have to look at, the Loftel, which is, if you've seen it, it is an empty building that has pieces of plastic hanging down where windows are supposed to be. It was intended to be something, then recession happened, then it's been switched, and now there's a bunch of antennas on top. They claim they can't do a lot due to permitting issues. At the end of the day, it is an eyesore in an otherwise neighborhood that it's growing in exponentially. And so here we are stuck literally with, I think, not only high-end Blythe, but also a huge project that we have to see every day. And so how do we incentivize and push? That's the question I think that I come here to this hearing about, and pushing them to do something. When we do try to find what permits or violations are available, there are some, but they just do some, kind of window dressing and keep moving. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on the Loftel or what we can do right now as the City of Boston.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Councilor. And it's a building that I think I agree with you, we would love to see developed. I don't know the details of current ownership and where they are and why not, but be willing to approach them and try to understand their goals and see if in fact the city can incentivize something there.
So there, and I'll just give you, and I understand we can't this, but there's a conflict. They're claiming that they can't do a lot of the renovations because of an easement that utility companies have on the building that's preventing them from putting in electrical systems that they need, because they're on the roof, but they also have the roof plus 8 feet down into the building and space, and that's something that they inherited when they purchased it. But ultimately, how do we incentivize better stewardship? If I can't fight the easement, if you can't, whatever legal issues and battles someone had, how does the city get them to do more with what they have? We would just like them to put in windows, and they can paint happy people in the thing at this point. But it's horrible right now. When you walk by, you will get debris blown on you in some cases.
I don't honestly know how to incentivize the businesses, but they are responsible to maintain the building in good order. And we do take them through the violation process. If they don't react well to us, our mandate is to block the building from 8 feet above the ground to minimize access of people and pets. If there is a public nuisance being created by the building, if people are actually getting hit with debris that are coming out of the building, we can act on that.
Okay. And then, so just since we're talking about properties and how when they are becoming the nuisance issue, and I remember reading an article where you talked a little bit about our receivership program, and that's something I find very interesting, and I think it's an opportunity that I'd love to see increased participation and increased partnership with your office on, particularly as I see that as a building is coming into helping, I guess, neighbors to step up and put the money and time into caretaking or stewarding this building, and that they could receive it ultimately, if it goes into foreclosure and so on and so forth. But I'd love to hear about how that system works, and how we can only increase the partnership and stewardship of communities. I'm thinking of NOAA, I'm thinking of some CDCs, I know community groups that would happily help out with Loftel right now, if there's a way to push that so talk to me about that.
The receivership is a court process.
Right.
And it usually takes us a while to get to that point. I personally think receivership is an excellent way of resolving some of these issues because, as I've explained to this council before, you can take a building that may be at such a state that it cannot get a mortgage.
Right.
So the owner of the building is at a huge disadvantage. The court appoints a receiver. The receiver goes through the revitalization of the building. The owner is given the opportunity by the judge to pay the bills for the repairs, and then ownership or control of the building, they don't lose ownership until the judge determines that, is returned back to the person. And when these buildings are revitalized, they are now livable, so the chances of getting a mortgage are very good. A lot of people fight us on receivership a lot. They don't want to lose control of their building. But we don't have a lot of cases, but we have some, especially recently of note, that are really good. The other thing that we try to do, and Sheila and I had a couple of properties that we worked on collectively with both the state and a lot of subsidy issues to take a landlord that was doing that. He had vacant apartments, he had dilapidated apartments, and through a collective action of the city departments, we were able to get the court to appoint an executor to it, and they went through the best effort of selling it. And then through the city's efforts, we were able to direct that and support one of the CDCs to get control of this property. It was a win-win for everybody. None of the tenants were displaced. The buildings now have stewardship that's real positive, and it's all community-based, so we were very happy. We don't have as many of those as we'd like, but we really, when we seize the opportunity, we really go after it.
Yeah, and I would love to sit down with you all to talk about how we can increase or support that process, you know, whether we're going to use legal services, whether we're going to do something. But I think in as much as neighbors are ready to step up, instead of just complaining to the city to do something, I'd love for them to be at the table to also get it done. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I know we have a second panel. I would like to invite the first panel if they would like to stay. You could, but I would also like to invite down the second panel now. That would include Allison Carter. And I'd like to say thank you to the first panel for being here, for taking our questions, for being responsive, and for all you do across the city. We appreciate everything you do. So the second panel would be Allison Carter, Aaliyah Hamada Forrest, and Chuck Collins. Good afternoon to all three of you.
Good afternoon.
You care to make opening statements? Would you care to make opening statements?
Yeah. Who wants to go first?
I'll go ahead. My name's Allison Carter. I'm the Economic Development Coordinator for the Town of Arlington. As Councilor Siomo mentioned, I'm a former director of Brighton Main Streets. It's nice to be back here in Boston, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm here to speak about our town's registration and maintenance of vacant commercial and industrial buildings bylaw. It's a mouthful. So in June of 2015, Arlington Center had 17 vacant commercial properties, many of which had been vacant for a year or more. By September of 2017, that number had dropped to 5. This is largely in part to the bylaw, which was approved by Arlington Town Meeting in October of 2016. Excuse me. The bylaw aims to reduce the number of vacant storefronts by requiring property owners to register their vacancies with the Department of Planning and Community Development. Owners pay an annual registration fee of $400 per vacant storefront, and that's defined as a property that has not been occupied for 90 days or more. The fee can be waived if the property owner can demonstrate financial hardship, or if they agree to display art or do some sort of pop-up type installation. The waiver, however, has to be renewed on a quarterly basis, so you can't just elect to have a waiver and wash your hands of it for a year. So there's a checking in that's built in. The registration fee is $400 because they're required to get quarterly building inspections to assure that the property is safe. So those cost the town $100 a month, $100 per inspection, so 4 inspections a year. That's how we arrived at that registration fee. We wanted it to, again, be something that moved people along, but not so onerous a fee that it was thought to be punitive. So far it has worked very well. It has motivated commercial property owners to rent their spaces, but more importantly, it's opened up a regular dialogue between the town and these property owners. And so we have a much greater awareness of what's going on, which is nice. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chuck Collins. Thank you, Chairman Flynn and President Campbell, and particularly Matt O'Malley, who I've worked with for many years. And my name is Chuck Collins. I'm a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a research group that looks at inequality issues. I'm going to back up and sort of give a kind of a little bit of a global picture here, which is part of what we're dealing with is a changing global economy where billions, trillions of dollars are looking for a safe haven, looking for places to touch down in real property in the form of investments that will hold their value. And Boston, along with a lot of other coastal cities, is one of those sort of super cities where not only are we experiencing the normal cycles of investment and disinvestment and gentrification, but we're actually sort of seeing supercharged trends because of huge amounts of global capital. This is not sort of our parents' or grandparents' vacancy issues. So one of the challenges, I think, is that cities are trying to catch up in terms of public policy just to understand what's happening, and that's why I commend the council for just having this discussion, trying to grapple with these forces. As Chairman Flynn said, there are both commercial and residential properties that are really wealth storage units. They are not homes. They are not commercial units that are being used for businesses. They are ways to preserve an asset, and that is its main purpose. And the reason we should be concerned is that they are disrupting local markets. They're disrupting the real estate market. The sort of gentrification forces downtown with these luxury buildings sort of pushes out and affects our neighborhoods. We're building new energy infrastructure to support these new luxury buildings. An interesting side dimension, One Dalton Place, which is now being built. And if you look at the Prudential Center, you'll see it's catching up quickly to the Prudential Center. Gives its investors an EB-5 visa for investing $1 million in their units. So it's actually contributing to inequities in our immigration system. People are buying their citizenship or buying a green card by virtue of investing in those properties. Some of them are so self-contained that Architectural Digest recently wrote an article saying, who needs a neighborhood when you have wild amenities like these? And so again, One Dalton Place is building its own park. It's going to be a sort of self-contained universe for the very, very wealthy. We do know a little bit, you were asking Councilor O'Malley about the sort of the occupancy issues, and Sheila Dillon is right. We don't know among these large luxury properties how many are actually vacant, but we do know a couple things. We know something about how many are owned by shell corporations, trusts, LLCs, where they mask the actual beneficial owners who owns it, and we do know something about how many of those units take the residential exemption. And we have a study coming out in a couple of weeks, but here's a preview of that. Of the 1,500 most recently constructed luxury units, so that's Millennium Tower, Millennium Place, the Ritz-Carlton, the Harborview, and 22 Liberty Place. Those properties, about 1,500 units, roughly a third of them are owned by shell corporations. Half of them do not take the residential exemption, 60, 70% in some cases. In the case of Millennium Tower, which I think the shadow will be coming our way shortly, that 443-unit building, 36% of those units are shell corporations, 79% do not take the residential exemption. When I talk about shell corporations, that's important because when we have this, we've heard a couple of people on the panel talk about how we don't know who owns these properties. It is actually harder to get a Boston Public Library card than it is to create a shell corporation to own some of these units, because to get a Boston Public Library card, you have to say who you are and where you live, and that's not the case with these corporations. So what can we do about that? I think looking at the vacancy issue is one issue. Some cities are looking at high-end real estate transfer taxes as another way to address the cost to the community of these high-end properties. Some cities globally are looking at requiring a disclosure of beneficial owner. Who are you? who really owns this property. If you want to participate in legal remedies, you need to say who you are. You need to be as bold as a library card. Say who you are and where you live. So those are things that we could talk about in another context. My colleague Emma DeGode and I did a policy brief, which we will share with you, that looks at what other cities are doing specifically on this vacancy issue, both commercial and residential, and just a few brief observations. One is they all define vacant as properties that sit empty at least 6 months of the year. That seems to be sort of almost a uniform standard. There is this concern both about blight and just empty buildings. And even in this discussion, I think President Campbell's talking about vacant buildings that are sort of festering in the neighborhood, but we also have empty units in an acute affordable housing crisis, along with empty commercial spaces. Those are three sort of issues. Some of these ordinances address all of those. They provide lots of exemptions for people who are renovating their property, who are when there's a change in ownership, other circumstances. Most of them levy a tax or a fine that's tied to the square footage. So in the case of Washington, D.C., which actually has had an ordinance in place since 2010, Washington, D.C. charges $5 per $100 of assessed value. If the property is blighted, they charge double, $10 for every $100 of assessed value. Washington, D.C. may be the city that we want to look the closest at in terms of what they've done, because I think they were both concerned about the sort of vacant blight, but also high-end blight. And so I think, and they recently, their city auditor did a blistering 100-page assessment of how they haven't really managed that program very well. So we could learn from their mistakes, perhaps. The other one that's interesting, and I should say almost all these ordinances are new. We don't have years of track record. We don't, some of them are just in the last 2 years responding to these conditions. Vancouver, Canada, Vancouver, British Columbia has an empty homes tax that's been in place just for a year, but they were experiencing high-end empty homes, what they described as sort of almost ghost town community conditions in some neighborhoods because of international capital, international investments. So that tax is a 1% tax on the assessed value each year if a unit is kept vacant. And they require, kind of like Arlington, they require the owners to proactively register whether the property, certify that the property is vacant, and then they have a very stiff penalty in the event that they find that the unit is indeed vacant and they've registered as an occupied unit. Almost like 100% surcharge on assessed value. So they have this empty homes tax, but they have a very high penalty for basically fabricating. So those are just a couple of the observations, and I will circulate this brief with you all and I'm happy to work with your team. And as we get more data on the high-end vacancy issue, we will share that with the council. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Aaliyah Hamada Forrest. I'm the director of Rosendale Village Main Street. Thank you for having me, especially Councilor O'Malley for inviting me to the panel. In the past year, RVMS has hosted several pop-ups as a way to bring life to vacancies. We've had larger term ones, like the one we brokered with Trillium at Trillium Garden at the substation. We've had shorter term ones, like our indoor drum circle and open house and another storefront. Some facts about Rosendale Village: we have 147 storefronts, about a 5.4% vacancy rate. 5 of our vacancies have been vacant for at least 1 to 4 years. And unfortunately, the vacancies are in close proximity to each other, so it looks worse than it is. And the same neighboring businesses continue to be frustrated with that. There are also some vacancies that have been leased but still look vacant because the tenant is stuck somewhere in the world of permitting and licensing, And sometimes that business pulls out, and the property owner has to start over, and we've seen that a couple of times. Other ways RVMS has worked to grapple with the vacancies issue has been to create a vacancies map that's public on our website. So it connects property owners and potential tenants with who to contact if they're interested in learning more about that vacancy. We've also had a design committee project, empty storefront signage. So instead of an empty space, you see a sign that directs you to that vacancies website. Some successes we've seen with the prop-up program has been an increase of foot traffic. Pop-ups have brought people into the business district for something temporary and exciting. The Trillium Beer Garden brought, at the most, the count was about 19.5 thousand people came to Roslindale over the course of 3 months. That might have been repeated people, but there was a lot of people in the neighborhood who have never heard of Roslindale before, ever. People from New Hampshire came to Roslindale. Pop-ups bring community members who may have never been inside or not in a long time into a space to dream. Some of these people ended up being potential tenants. So we had a pop-up in a vacant storefront that brought in families in particular. It was a build zone. It was targeted at young children to build these contraptions in a vacant storefront. And a couple of parents ended up renting that space, and it will soon be Roslindale's first brewery, Distraction Brewery, owned by parents of Roslindale and West Roxbury kids who came to the Build Zone pop-up. I would echo what Allie said. It also opened lines of communication with property owners who we may have not spoken with beforehand, specifically because we had a project we wanted to talk about. It engaged property owners. We always invited property owners to the pop-ups, and it inspired property owners to think more about their neighbors' wants and needs and what would be successful in the space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to ask Councilor O'Malley if you'd like to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all, and thank you guys for your patience. I know we got you on a little bit later than we had hoped, but I specifically wanted to bring this panel together, Allie, to talk about sort of your perspective as a former Boston Main Street's head and now in Arlington, what you've done. Chuck, you've done such amazing work on so many important social justice issues, economic issues, and I appreciate sort of giving us the 50,000-foot view display on what we can do and what we ought to be doing. And Aaliyah, my God, you've done such a remarkable job at Rosendale Village Main Streets, the first Main Streets district in the city of Boston that is just thriving. And I was one of those tens of thousands of people at the Trillium Brewery, perhaps more than once. It was just such a great thing to show. We're not looking at being punitive. There's been a little negative feedback to this hearing order, but we want to help these businesses. The city can absolutely play a role and should play a role, but we also need to use every arrow in our quiver. So my first question is, I was talking to my co-sponsor, Council President Campbell, on this. I think we're going to ask the chair not to adjourn this hearing, but to suspend this hearing and then transition into a series of working sessions. And I'd love it if you three could join us just to continue to offer your perspective. So I assume the answer, you guys would be willing to do that. And I also want to acknowledge Danielle Joseph, who does amazing work at West Roxbury Main Streets. Thank you for your great work as well. So very, very briefly, Allie, we'll start with you. What sort of was the impetus that had Arlington to come up with the idea of the vacancy fee?
It was not just that there were vacancies. I mean, it's part of the commercial climate, but it was that there was a concentration of long-term vacancies in the central business district. And when you looked at the properties, you could basically identify 3 property owners. And so we called them all in and had meetings with them. And again, we got a better picture of what was going on, but it became clear that some might need more motivation to actually do their due diligence to try and rent their properties. And so that's when we decided it rose to the level of needing a bylaw.
And then did the town selectmen put the bylaw before town meeting? Did a resident, how does it work in terms of enacting an ordinance or a law?
That's a great question. So there was a lot of residents were getting really upset, and they were calling the selectmen and they were calling the town manager's office and just saying, how can they be allowed to do this, these property owners, for such a long time? They were afraid it was going to decrease their property values. And so the first paragraph of the bylaw as it ended up being written is essentially states that, you know, the commercial property owners have a responsibility to maintain their properties they're private properties, but they are in public space. And that lays the foundation for kind of the philosophy behind it. And yeah, so it was some citizen involvement, and then they got the town officials involved.
And it was a vote and passed overwhelmingly?
It passed very, very overwhelmingly, because we have town meeting, it's representative town meeting, but for residents, it was a pretty easy sell.
And what's the population of Arlington?
44,000 roughly.
So it's a little bit larger than, you know, Jamaica, a neighborhood in Boston. But my point is those statistics are remarkable. 17 vacant properties June 2015, 5 vacant properties in September of 2017.
And that's just in the central business district. There are 2 other commercial districts and 1 industrial district, but yeah, that was the center of town.
Okay. Aaliyah, a business owner comes to you and says, or a landlord, I should say, comes to you and says, I can't find a good tenant for my hearing. Talk a little bit, very briefly, sort of what you would do, how the city could be helpful, and maybe other steps that we should be thinking of.
Sure. We get calls all the time from potential businesses, business owners, entrepreneurs, especially if they live in Roslindale and they see the vacancies.
Yeah.
And so I have a list in my office of people who have called, and I connect them with the landlord. We broker that relationship, or we connect them with a realtor or broker who's representing the landlord. The way the city could be helpful is if there are, and Boston Main Street directors also have like a Google group, and we connect, and sometimes we pass along businesses that may not be the best fit for certain districts, but maybe a better fit in other districts. Maybe the city has a similar list. I wouldn't be surprised if business owners contacted the Office of Economic Development directly, and sometimes we'll get a little like, hey, Flatbread Pizza Company is looking for space in Roslindale. Does your district have a space good enough? And that happens very rarely, but I would love to see it more and get contacted more by the city, I think, by business contacts.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And then finally, so there are 5 vacant stores in RVMS that have been vacant for more than 4 years.
Yeah.
Have you gone to the landlords, and I'm not looking for you to betray any confidence, but I would venture a guess that at least with some of them you've gone to the landlord and said, hey, I have someone who's interested. And has the issue been that they're holding out for more money?
It varies. Some of it is holding out for more money. Some of it's a landlord who wants something very, very specific in their space, and that tenant just hasn't come around yet, and it's a preference. And sometimes the landlord isn't in town or lives in Los Angeles or is traveling abroad frequently and you can't even get in touch with them.
Yeah.
That happens a lot too.
Yeah. Okay. And then Chuck, briefly, you know, we're talking about vacant storefronts, we're talking about vacant apartments, particularly as sort of investment units, we're talking about vacant lots as well. Do you see something that's sort of a tool or a policy we could put in place that could address all 3, or should we be focused on these sort of individually?
I think just raising the cost of vacancy, you know, disincentivizing keeping units vacant for long periods of time. So if in a case like the Roslindale property where if a property stays vacant for 4 years, it's starting to, you know, cost you, you know, the real costs to the community are being assessed on you.
Absolutely.
Then you may think about it differently. So I think that would be the case. It's hard to know on high-end real estate what that cost point would be, where it would matter.
Yeah.
That's a new art to figure that out.
Indeed. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's it for this round.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Council President Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn, and thank you guys for being here. Obviously, you've addressed many different things, and I appreciate the hard work you do. I think one of the things I wanted to flag when listening to you guys, and I look forward to Chief Barros giving us more data on the commercial vacancies, is that there are some neighborhoods in the city of Boston that don't have a main streets. Codman Square, for example, being one of them, which is in my district, who've been talking about the possibility of what that could look like to get a main streets. There are maybe some vacancies, maybe not, but maybe there's businesses that people are like, what is this? But there is one particular space that's been vacant for a long time. So I just flag that for the audience that's viewing this, that's probably a real challenge, and frankly look forward to working with Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Flynn on addressing the issue of how do we compile data for those neighborhoods in the city of Boston who are highly recommended, who are listed in the data that we got for vacant lots from D&D, but who don't have a main streets, for example, or those entrepreneurial leaders to go out and do the very work that you guys are doing or that you used to do every single day. So I will be pushing for thinking outside the box for those communities that don't have those. One thing I would like to hear is when we talk about disincentivizing vacancy, some of it is for private owners, and then it's also for the city of Boston. And one of the things I think we heard today is the lack of resources. And I don't like to accept no, so I think it's how do we think outside the box and say, how do we go to private institutions or the 1% in the city of Boston or whomever to say, we as a city don't want our parcels to be vacant. We want to activate them in some way. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it is community residents saying, we don't want that, we want something else. But I frankly find that very rare. I think it's more about what are people going to do, and is there the willpower to do something? So for me, if it's resources, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think in terms of resources that might be available to activate these spaces, whether in a temporary manner or something more permanent, particularly for the city-owned lots.
Yeah. You know, I was talking about a real estate transfer tax. The city of San Francisco levied a very high-end real estate transfer tax on both commercial and residential properties over $5 million. Last year, it raised an estimated $44 million, which the city has deployed in a particular way. But that's an interesting idea. You know, let's look at both the disruption caused and at directing funds in a way that can strengthen the community. So if it's strengthening enforcement, you know, making a linkage between those revenue sources. A high-end vacancy tax, maybe that each year, that's sort of like each year a property's vacant, the rate goes up, so it really does create an incentive to rent or move that property. That revenue could be tied to enforcement or could be tied to supporting activities on public property. So looking for those links to the disruption caused by high-end real estate and solving our problems could be a way to go.
And I'd like to think that, we're not going to necessarily tax ourselves in our own parcels, but I refuse to accept that there's not enough resources in the city of Boston or the greater Boston area or the Commonwealth to deal with these city-owned parcels that presently present as vacant and that offer probably blight and other things in certain communities. And I would love, and we're going to continue this conversation to think about where the resources might exist. If it's not in the city of Boston, who external to the city and the government is interested in activating these spaces? Some of them are developers. Yeah. How do you incentivize people to come to a Mattapan where I live when people have this expectation of what Mattapan is all about? And I'm often pushing back on that narrative to say, you don't know Mattapan because you probably haven't been there, or parts of Dorchester even, to incentivize people to come. So I think it's multifaceted, but as we continue these conversations, I really encourage folks, even some folks who obviously couldn't be here today, to think about what does that, how do we incentivize folks to go to every part of the city of Boston to make sure that we're doing something that has, that just changes the face of these properties and activates the space. And I think the best place to start are the city-owned parcels in particular, because we have that data, it's readily available. It may not be as friendly to look at on the website, and I've been on the website, so I think I'm going to follow with Chief Dillon about presenting it differently. And also so people know what's happening with the vacant lot that's been sitting vacant for 10 years. So I'd love for us to just continue to think about that, and if it is resources, then who the heck in this city is willing to do something? Thank you, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Campbell. I just had one question, Mr. Collins. I know you talked about shell corporations. Can you explain that, just so we have a better understanding? Are we talking about overseas money coming into Boston, or are they used as a tax, a way to hide taxes, or what is the definition, or what are we seeing in Boston as it relates to a shell corporation?
Yeah, well, maybe starting at the highest level, the global force is basically there's trillions of dollars moving around the globe, pretty much trying to hide from accountability, reporting, taxation. So we don't know necessarily who owns those properties, because the shell corporation doesn't require any disclosure who actually benefits from the ownership. It may be registered. It could be registered in Delaware or Wyoming, or it could be registered in the Cayman Islands or Bermuda. So it could be offshore, could be linked to bank accounts. So basically money is moving around. What's interesting is it actually, though, touches down. You can't all stay in the investment market, as Councilor O'Malley says. It doesn't all want to stay in the stock market. Some of it wants to come and land in real property just as an asset class, as a way to protect the wealth. And so some of that global wealth, and it could be Russian oligarchs, Chinese multimillionaires worried about state appropriation in their host country, moving their money out. Could be money laundering from illegal purposes or legal purposes. We don't really know, because that's the whole hidden nature of it. But it is parking. Some of it is parking here in Boston, and it's parking in buildings that we walk by every day. So we don't know the answer to that, and that's a global problem in a way. But there are cities, and London is really interesting in this way, that are starting to say, well, actually, we want to know who owns these properties from a money laundering point of view, from a criminal activity, cracking down on that. And real estate is a different type of ownership, and you can actually require disclosure of a real estate asset. You can say who really is the beneficiary here. And so London and several other cities are saying, yeah, you want to own property in London, you have to tell us who you are. If you want to have legal standing to sue your neighbor or evict a tenant or whatever, you need to say who you are. And we could be one of the leading, and I would say that all these policies, we should look at what New York is doing, Miami, and actually sort of look and moving in tandem with other cities to the extent it's ever possible to coordinate, to at least keep track of what other cities are doing, because I think we're all kind of grappling with these same issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilor Edwards?
Thank you. So I had a couple suggestions or questions as well. First of all, my compliments to the panel, incredibly well-informed. I thought your ideas and what you've been already working on is extremely helpful. So thank you so much, and also thank you to my colleague, Councilor O'Malley, for your leadership on getting this hearing done. I'm personally very excited about what I think Boston can do. A couple things that I'd love to see or hear your thoughts about, maybe that we would continue the conversation in a working session. One is, while we're talking about causing folks or businesses to pay, I guess, their fair share in the blight that they're bringing to the community, and de-incentivizing, vacancy. Is there any thought, or has there been any movement by cities? And I do support some form of that, but is there any thought or any research that you've done that shows cities that might be providing tax relief to someone to get them to do something, maybe a pop-up or something like that? Has there been any push to say, okay, so your local property taxes are due? We've received several complaints about this being a vacant spot. Since you're already current on your taxes, and again, that was one of their biggest issues, is that people who are paying their taxes and there's no real problem with the property, that they're not going to get under the city's attention, but the problem is that nothing's happening for us. So has there been an incentive, or have you seen in any other city okay, so you're paying your taxes, but wouldn't you like some property tax relief by putting some business in there or pop-up? Has there been any examples of that?
I haven't seen that, but that's a really good idea.
Thank you. But so maybe something we could talk about in the working session. Another thought for, and I really love the pop-up idea. I'm part of a martial arts group that's always looking for a storefront to be able to house ourselves. And part of my curiosity about the businesses that you're finding and the storefronts that might be available is, do we have a meetup online? Is there a place where someone could list their vacant property, and a place where local nonprofits or arts or kids or organizations can also be there, almost like a match, or I don't know, with Tinder or something that we can match these two together? Do you think the city could support that, or maybe Main Streets could be part of initiating that, so that we're getting those storefronts again that are current on property, are not quite in the blight level, but are available and not being used?
The Google group I mentioned for Boston Main Street directors, I think that we started something like that, but it wasn't there's lots of turnover with Main Street directors, and sometimes things don't go as planned. But
that's
I
another
would love
hearing topic, but
different topic.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I would like to see a Tinder-esque
kind of match up.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Match.com.
Like
for
something like
vacancies.
that, like, something's calling out for, and then but maintained by Main Streets. I kind of wanted to follow up a little bit on my last question on Councilor Flynn's questioning about the global market and what's happening. And I know New York has actually, when it comes to some of the vacancy or the unoccupied units, they've followed their criminal statutes, right? And looking at, and began investigating who owns some of that property, because of the fact that it was used as money laundering by some Russian oligarchs. And the fact is, it's a wonderful way to hide your money and also inflate the housing prices, because you're incentivized to pump as much money into it, right? So you want to buy it for as much as possible, even if it's inflated amount, because you want your money to be kept safe in the building or whatever. And so I'm curious, in your research about Massachusetts criminals, I don't know if you've looked at our statute. Is there a way in which we can go criminally, or in terms of investigating, to get behind that veiled wall from LLCs and stuff? And corporations?
It's a great question, and I will definitely look into that, because clearly in New York, it's been part of being in such a globalized economy, globalized city. The FBI and other national law enforcement have spent a lot of time in New York. I don't know about the parallel here in Boston.
Okay.
So, but I'll look into that, because I think it might be.
For a working session then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to the panel for being here, for your testimony. It was very informative and very helpful. We're going to take public comments now. Would like to invite you to stay for the public comment period. But I just want to, on behalf of my colleagues, say thank you for being here.
Thank you, and count us in for the working group.
Thank you.
And at this public hearing, I'm going to call 3 people at a time. And if you want to come down to the microphone on the left or the microphone on the right, starting with Stephanie. Oh, I'm sorry. Starting with Danielle Joseph. And also, is Anthony Giordano here as well? If you could follow after her. And if I'm pronouncing it right, Pamela Schwartz.
Hello, everyone. I'm Danielle Joseph from West Roxbury Main Streets. Thank you for holding this hearing. We are just happy to be part of this conversation. West Roxbury Main Streets finds it important to address the commercial vacancy issue in our district and throughout Boston. We agree that long-term vacancies damage the ability for our business district to thrive. West Roxbury Main Streets is committed to working with the city, landlords, existing and prospective businesses, West Roxbury residents, and other stakeholders to promote the vibrancy of our Main Street. We appreciate the council for looking into this issue and finding ways to collect data and incentivize our local landlords. Would love to be part of the continued conversation in the working groups in the future, and we thank the other Main Street directors for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for the record, could you state your name and your address, please?
Sure. My name's Anthony Giordano, board president of RV Mass. I work with Aaliyah very closely. I'm also a relatively new landlord in Rosendale Village myself. And I'm really looking forward to all the ideas that are coming forth here. The only thing I want to say is that finding a good tenant is difficult, and making that match is extremely difficult. And there's a lot of work that goes on to actually get to that point. So, you know, I'm looking forward to everything that you guys can do to help us out next time, because you do one and 3 years later, you're back right where you started. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And I'd like to call down anyone else that would like to testify. I do have some names, but we can go in order. Is there a Pamela Schwartz? Meg? Meg from the Back Bay Association? Okay. And David Coughlin? Just walk right to the microphone, sir. Yeah, you can start. And just for the record, state your name and address, please.
I'm Brian Wilson, and I'm at 43 Lords Ave. So I'm here because of some of the great work that Councilman O'Malley helped us with. I was one of the tenants at 128 Brookside, which was the last freestanding artist building in Jamaica Plain that housed work-only spaces. Most of the artists in that building, there was 22 of us that have been displaced by a landlord who came in to basically leave the property vacant. He hasn't submitted any plans, to my knowledge, to the city for building. And this is an issue. It's an issue for artists, where the new space that I'm in is in Dorchester, and recently investors came to look at that property as well. Arts in this city is important to the vitalization and the revitalization of certain neighborhoods, and there's no buildings left to do that. To speak to Councilman Edwards, Philadelphia did actually have a revitalization program where they invited artists to set up studios, sort of like a pop-up, but artist studios in that space. There was tax breaks to the property owner for allowing artists to work in that space. The artists left the space better than it actually was in the beginning. They were responsible for paint and upkeep and that sort of thing while they were there. And I'm just really appreciative that we're getting this conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. My name is Martin Rutt. I'm chair of the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay, but I'm not presenting an official NAB position here, merely a number of observations and comments based upon conversations that we've had among our members. The first point I'd like to make is that we make a clear distinction between residential and commercial. And in terms of residential, well, 1 Dalton Place is in the Back Bay. And that's an illustration of one of the challenges that we face. One of the things I would like to be able to do is to figure out how, when somebody who owns a place in 1 Dalton Place is actually there, and then if we can sneak past security and persuade them to become members of the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay and join in all our fun activities like cleaning up the alleys, removing graffiti, and so forth. We would, of course, promise them the most expensive champagne if they come along and assist us in those activities. The other aspect of this in the residential sense is, of course, the future of short-term rentals, on which I know a vote is supposedly to be taken tomorrow in the city council meeting. And I'd like to draw here upon experiences in Berlin. That's Berlin, Germany, not Berlin, New Hampshire. Because in this endeavor, we have done our best with other neighborhood associations in Boston to draw upon experiences and attempts by cities not only throughout North America, but also around the world as to what to do. And one of the observations in Berlin was they passed one set of regulations that were pretty strict and then realized that that wasn't working. They took a significant number of units back into the market, and then the same number of units popped up because people were holding them for hopes of a future profit. So one of the things that they then decided was to introduce some very, very harsh fines. In fact, the maximum fine now, if you're vacant for too long, which is actually, I think the period now is 3 months rather than 6 months, is 500,000 euros, which is about $670,000, I think, at the current exchange rate. So that's one set of issues. The other one is commercial properties. And there, our major concern in the Back Bay is with Newbury Street, which, as you know, is suffering not only from local issues, because in fact it turns out that a number of businesses have moved to other parts of the city, which is not necessarily bad for Boston, like the South End, a number of galleries. Some people are more interested in going to the seaport or even downtown Crossing, but also, in fact, the global forces that are affecting brick and mortar retail stores everywhere. Now, what our concern there would be, what would be the impact of vacancy fines? And we simply don't know. So we hope, for example, that one of the aspects of the short-term rental ordinance, even though that's applied to residential, is that one will take account and go back regularly after 6 months or a year and see what is going on. But it will depend upon a lot of the devilish details, how large are the fines, how they're applied, how they're enforced, and so forth. I'd like to say that NAB does play a role in permitting, which seems to be a significant factor for businesses. We have a licensing and building use committee, an architecture committee, which reviews projects that are put forward to us, whether it's a restaurant, a retail store, or whatever. And generally speaking, we deal with it fairly rapidly once the project is made known to us. But at the same time, we're aware of the fact that people are concerned that the permitting process takes too long. And what we would like to see is a much more cooperative venture working together between ourselves, businesses and developers, the Back Bay Association, the Newbury Street League, which are business associations, to figure out how to deal with this problem. Because even though our mission is to help residents, we recognize that having a vibrant commercial district is good for residents. In fact, a number of our members are indeed owners or work in some of these businesses. So we hope that we'll be able to find some solutions. I would just as a final remark say that generally my experience in life has been you can get so far with sticks, but it also helps to have some carrots. And we know that Boston and the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts give large incentives or sweeteners to very big businesses to come here and do things. And we wish that there are a way of finding equivalent sweeteners to give to small businesses to help overcome some of the problems that they encounter in, for example, setting up on Newbury Street. I've had some discussions with people about how much revenue they need to be able to develop in order to make it worthwhile, particularly given the very high rents. And we do know, for example, that there's some developers or owners who have very large buildings, and they're not willing to give long leases to businesses who only take up a small part of that building because they're biding their time, hoping that some big company, who knows, Amazon, may come along and take the whole shebang at once. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue with you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your testimony. Yes, sir, if you could state your name and address, please.
My name is John Buxton. I live at 185 Mass Ave across from Berkeley and Christian Science Church. I'm a member of the board of the Fenway Civic Association, but am not speaking on behalf of the association here. The bottom line in this issue is exactly the same as with Airbnb and other short-term rentals. We are destroying our neighborhoods by allowing people to come in, build one Dalton if you wish, take over buildings in Chinatown and rent them out by the day. Whatever it is they're doing, they are ruining our neighborhoods. People can no longer, who work in the city and who have a requirement to live in the city, they can't afford to live in the city anymore. I'm a little dismayed that the other counselors aren't here. Please pass on these serious concerns. It's been going on for a long time to the other counselors, and the city has disappeared. I'm delighted that Arlington has wonderful ideas. I taught in Arlington for 9 years, and I'm going to warn Arlington that if they're not careful, they are going to have a terrible problem with investors buying property along Mass Ave, taking those properties and renting them out by the night at $400 a night, telling people that they can take the 79 bus to the Red Line T and get into Boston in no time at a single fare. And we're just pushing the problem farther and farther out. We need to put a stop to these businesses ruining our neighborhoods. Thank you very much for hearing it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Go ahead, sir, if you'd state your name and address, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at the meeting. My name is Mike Jamin. I'm a resident of the Back Bay at Commonwealth Avenue, and I'm a principal of Urban Meritage, a real estate investment and development company. Over the past 12 years, Urban Meritage has invested on its own and on behalf of its clients over $500 million on Newbury Street, and has been involved with the ownership of over 40 buildings. My comments relate specifically to Newbury Street and should not be construed as applying to other neighborhoods or neighborhood retail in general. I'm going to list some names for everyone now. True Religion Jeans, Kit and Ace, Calypso St. Barth, Scoop NYC, Jack Wills, Ibex, Stephen Allen, Jonathan Adler, BB, Nanette Lepore, American Apparel, Agent Provocateur. All of these retailers left Newbury Street over the last 2 years. None of them left because the rent was too high. The attempt to provide a correlation between rent levels and vacancy is simply not valid on Newbury Street. Rents are simply a function of supply and demand. These retailers left because they were closing all or most of their stores nationally. Many of these retailers actually performed well on Newbury Street, but they were not going to continue to operate a single store. This was, for the most part, self-inflicted by retailers as they overexpanded. It was a global market correction, and Newbury Street was part of the collateral damage, not the cause of it. And another wave will be happening this year and next year. As another example of the effect of supply and demand on Newbury Street, when the retail market last collapsed in 2008, 2009, as a part of the Great Recession, there were no new retailers seeking space. Rent levels could have dropped by 50%, and it wouldn't have made a difference, as there was no demand for space. Fortunately, this time is different. It is the first time when retail is facing a correction, yet the economy is strong. This will result in vacancy being filled more quickly, but the recovery will take some time and will not happen overnight. Retailers now, more than ever, are extremely particular when it comes to choosing a space. We have a space at 344 Newbury Street where we have 5 retailers competing to lease the space. Unfortunately, we will be able to choose only one to fill the space. This doesn't mean, however, that the 4 other retailers will end up on other spaces on Newbury. This particular space works well for these users, and it is about the right size, location, and the right co-tenancy for the retailer. Other vacancies on Newbury do not fulfill the requirements for this retailer. Unlike a mall, we simply can't move a demising wall to make a 1,400 square foot space 2,000 square feet, 2,400 square feet, or vice versa. We are restricted by the dimensions of the buildings. Suit Supply recently opened at 248 Newbury Street. They had been in the market for a Newbury Street location for almost 10 years. They signed their lease in December of 2015, and it took almost 30 months of construction between the base building and tenant improvements before they were ready to open. It is an example of the new face of retail and one of the most exciting additions to Newbury Street in years. It is a brand that is successfully globally. This is their 100th store, and on an e-commerce basis. It includes a food component to complement their services. Remember, this is the former Daisy Buchanan's location. The upper floors of the property were vacant for years under prior ownership. The lesson here is it takes time to fill vacancies. Some more names for everyone now. Suit Supply, Allbirds, T Forte, Credo Beauty, Jonquil's Cafe, Seabags, Faraday, Alice and Olivia, The Thai Bar, Le Labo, Roots, Cafe Nero, Champion. These retailers are all new to Newbury Street and have opened or will be opening between now and mid-2019. Some of these concepts didn't exist 5 years ago. All of these retailers take significant time in choosing locations and building their stores. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it isn't a freight train. Newbury Street is successful because of the retailers it is able to attract. Retailers who share a similar customer base like to congregate together. An example of this is Patagonia, Arc'teryx, the North Face, all on the Hereford, Massachusetts Avenue block of Newbury. Title Boxing, Boston Sports Clubs, SLT, Motion Fitness, Lululemon are also on this block. Chanel, Tiffany, Valentino, Burberry, Loro Piana, Cartier, Bulgari cluster on the first block of Newbury. None of these brands would ever dream of moving to another block. When vacant spaces are filled haphazardly, the damage can take years to repair, as undesirable uses sign 5 to 10-year leases. Some landlords have leased vacant space to smoke shops. There are now 4 of them on Newbury Street, and we receive a call or two on almost a weekly basis from others seeking space. None of the retailers I am aware of actually want to be next to a smoke shop as part of their co-tenancy. Nail salons are the other low-hanging fruit to fill vacant spaces. This use does not help attract other retailers to come to Newbury. As a property owner, we make the choice not to take the quick dollar and lease to these uses. Should we or any other landlord be penalized for this decision? Let's briefly talk about some numbers. Newbury Street consists of 342 storefronts and is now 91% occupied. That is an improvement from 87% occupied in January. It still means that there are approximately 30 vacancies on the street, though, which, until you compare it with the actual size of Newbury Street, looks like a lot. Most of this vacancy is concentrated on 2 blocks, one of which has a high concentration of smoke shops and nail salons, not coincidentally. Historically, Newbury Street vacancy increases in January through March, as it is the low point in the shopping season for consumers and weather is the least hospitable for outdoor shopping. Leases are timed this way and is the ideal time for new retailers to fit out their space. Without this context, a walk along Newbury Street during this time to identify vacancy or point out market weakness is simply misleading. For reference purposes, there are approximately 50 storefronts in the Prudential Center and 65 storefronts in Copley Place. That makes the number of storefronts on Newbury Street approximately 3 times the number of storefronts on the Prudential Mall and Copley combined. Newbury Street consists of 8 blocks. For comparison, Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills and Worth Avenue in Palm Beach are 3 blocks each. Our vision of Newbury Street is to provide something for everyone, whether that is a $100,000 piece of jewelry from Tiffany or Bulgari or a $5 item for TJ Maxx, H&M, or Nordstrom Rack. Everyone can enjoy the atmosphere, the people watching, the architecture, or experience Open Newbury at no cost. Our ideal retailers will locate their only area stores on Newbury. This differentiates the experience on Newbury from an urban or suburban mall. We have also experimented with different pop-up concepts to fill vacant spaces and energize the street, and have converted some of these temporary retailers to long-term leases. If the city is looking to fill the vacant spaces with the right retailers and wants to provide incentives to encourage landlords, why not provide a credit to the real estate taxes for a year or 2 when a space gets filled? This directly benefits the retailers during the critical stabilization period for a new location. The idea of penalizing landlords for vacant space can only lead to poor or rash decisions in leasing spaces to retailers not appropriate for the location. Thank you again for your time and consideration.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. Sir? If you state your name for the record and neighborhood you live in.
plane at 190 Green Street. So I'm around the corner from 128 Brookside, which the artist who spoke earlier spoke of. Also across the street from 197 Green Street, which is currently vacant, and 3350 Washington Street, which is also vacant. And I guess I want to focus a little bit on 197 Green. I think it's a story that you folks should hear in considering vacancy. So it's been vacant for 2 years, since 2016, presumably due to the current purchaser requiring it to be vacant to purchase it. And as a result of what I would say is a sort of speculative transaction, my neighbors aren't my neighbors anymore. There's a couple, I think 5 low-income people of color live there, had barbecues, were a really important part of the neighborhood. I still see them on the street sometimes when they come by to talk to folks on the street, but they live far out, probably I believe in Mattapan or further out. And the sad thing is they could have been living there for the past 2 years, right? Like they could still be there right now if it weren't for a sort of the speculative impetus sort of forcing them out. So I guess kind of to echo what Chuck was saying and some others are saying, you know, there are both monetary costs and also sort of unfathomable social costs to the speculation and the vacancy that we're seeing. In particular, you know, the social costs of communities of color, low-income folks that live in Boston, that work in Boston, are seeing their communities torn apart every day by these forces that you're trying to address in a small part with this consideration of different approaches to vacancy. So I guess, you know, as a neighbor who is next door to some, what I would consider, you know, the 197 Green Street parcel is blighted, I would say. The others, maybe not so much, but they've been vacant for many, many years. And it's a bummer. And actually, the other place where Exodus Bagels is now was vacant for, I think, over a year. And I knew the previous owners, and they basically they left because of rent speculation. So it took a while for that building to be not vacant again. So what's funny is that even though our economy is doing great, there's all these small businesses, in theory, that would be moving to my neighborhood. There are more vacancies now than there were during the financial crisis in my specific block, and that's sad to me. So I guess just to close, I would really I urge you to consider the cost to our neighborhood and our social fabric that these vacancies are having. And I think the incentives or the fines should be substantial and in line with those costs. So, you know, with all due respect to the $400 vacancy registration fee in Arlington, I don't think that's really going to do the trick in Boston. I feel like it needs to be a much more substantial fine that actually incentivizes people to do the right thing with their property and turn it over or sell it or whatever they need to do to make that sort of make that vacant space do something for neighbors in the neighborhood, and or maybe use some of those. The other piece that I would say is if there are funds that are levied from some kind of tax or whatever, that those be used to directly address the vacancy issue and directly address the issue of affordable housing in our communities, because folks are just getting slammed right now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. If you please state your name and where you live, sir.
Sure. My name is Chris Talanian. I'm a resident of 1 Huntington Ave in the Back Bay. It's been a long afternoon. I'll try to keep this brief. But I'm a third-generation property owner-operator in Boston. At present, my company manages 22 buildings, owns and manages 22 buildings in the Back Bay, 4 in the South End, and 2 on Beacon Hill. Even as retail leasing has seen an uptick in recent months, we're still in the midst of an industry transformation. While my company has comparatively few vacancies, we've still had problem spaces that have sat vacant for longer than anyone has really anticipated. Before a tenant leaves, I do my best to negotiate terms for them to stay, and that includes, in many cases, reducing their current rent. If a property does go vacant, I first put money back into the property to turn it over and make it presentable for a new tenant. I have a broker who works in my office full-time, whose only responsibility it is to lease space. I pay monthly memberships to leasing websites, and I distribute all of our listings on a twice-monthly basis to cooperating brokers. And even now, I'm offering cooperating brokers cash bonuses in addition to the half commissions they would normally be receiving. In so many words, I'm doing everything in my power to try and get space leased. We're also not looking for large increases in rent from one tenant to the next. In many cases, we're relisting space for what the previous tenant was paying, and in some cases less than what the previous tenants were paying. The retail landscape is changing, simply put. Brick and mortar retail is deciding what it wants to look like in the next 10 or 15 years. Couple that with the city's very disjointed and burdensome zoning and permitting process, and potential tenants are going to sit on the sidelines longer than they normally would when deciding if and when they want to expand. A tax on landlords for retail vacancy at a time when most of us are working harder than ever to get space leased feels like it's adding insult to injury. Newbury Street and Boylston Street landlords have already suffered a huge financial hit at the hands of the city at the 2015 spot tax assessment on commercial real estate tax, which resulted in some cases a 40% tax increase on our buildings. A tax on vacancy won't help to get space leased any faster. It'll just frustrate landlords and ultimately drive down property values. I don't believe this is an appropriate measure for the Back Bay. Not saying it's not appropriate for some other neighborhoods, but in the Back Bay, it feels a little impunitive. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is Eric Harrett. I am a resident of Jamaica Plain. Don't have a direct interest in any of the vacant properties in our area, but obviously as a resident, I have a lot of concerns. A couple of my predecessors brought up the vacancy or potential vacancy, I should say, of the 128 Brookside Artists Establishment in Jamaica Plain. It is currently vacant. However, we don't know what the plans going forward for it are. But I personally believe that there is a strong possibility that the owner of the property will use its vacancy as a method to try to convince the neighbors or the city to change the zoning plans for that property. Through the JP Rocks process, we sort of carefully considered exactly how we could design the zoning for that property so that it was likely to stay for artists' use. And unfortunately, that did not succeed. So I do want to make sure whatever policy is designed carefully so as to make sure to target that particular form of vacancy. I sympathize with commercial property owners here saying that, in fact, it is quite difficult to rent out commercial property. We often, as neighbors, request that new developments include commercial property with the knowledge that there isn't necessarily a vibrant commercial scene in the area that the property is being built, but in the hope that one day there might be. And I think we need to be sensitive to that when designing a vacancy tax. There are properties we've asked to be built that there is no viable way to occupy them today. But at the same time, I think we have to look at the fact that a lot of the, as some of my predecessors here have stated, a lot of the there are retail tenants that have disappeared because retail business is suffering from the competition from the internet, from Amazon. And that's not likely to change anytime soon. But I think it means that a lot of the things that are likely to use a retail space are the kinds of businesses that can really only function locally, like restaurants and, unfortunately for some people, I suppose, nail salons. And I think as a city, that puts the burden on us to try to figure out what are ways that we can make the barrier to entry for some of those businesses a little lower. It's extremely hard to start a restaurant in Boston. If you want to serve alcohol, it's almost impossible. I personally know a few people who are owners of restaurants who have bought property and sat on it for 2 or 3 years while they simply wait for their licensing to go through. And that's just like a completely normal part of opening a restaurant in Boston. If you're next to one of those properties, though, you probably think of it as being blighted. I think restaurants are only the tip of the iceberg. You know, there's a grocery store in Jamaica Plain right now that was seeking to get, I think it was a takeout victualer's license. And because one resident a couple of houses away didn't like the sound of their air conditioner or their freezer unit, they are on hold for that for a year. Now that property is already open, but there are definitely many others that suffer through this entire process for years. And some of them may never open because they don't manage to get, they don't have the cash cushion to sit on while they wait and make sure that every single neighbor nearby is pleased. You know, I do think it's important that neighbors' interests be taken into account, but I think we have to balance that against the fact that if it takes 2 or 3 years to open even the most basic kind of business, that just means that a lot of lower cash businesses, lower profit margin businesses are just never going to be able to exist in the city. And a lot of these small 1,000-square-foot properties are perfect for those kinds of businesses. So if we make it impossible to start one, and in a sinking retail market, that is a recipe for vacancy. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony.
And we are 2 MIT graduate students, and we created a startup called Spaces because we were frustrated by the number of vacancies we experienced as we walked down the streets in major commercial areas.
So our company Spaces transforms vacant storefronts into collective and collaborative artist studios. By doing so, we give artists space to work in the heart of the city, we return local creativity to neighborhoods, and we offer landlords a hassle-free solution to bridge between tenants.
Our hope is to use the existing and underutilized assets in a city as platforms for artists to make. Simply put, we want to support local artists by giving them space to make work. And we do this because we believe in our core that when artists have space in the city, everyone benefits.
Artists bring diverse groups of people together, and they make space to question the status quo. We think that these elements are integral to maintaining and preserving a city's local character. And we're excited about ways that our stores can be spaces for people to come together around art. We've just completed a successful first pilot at Faneuil Hall Marketplace right down the road, which gave artists space to exhibit and brought together a diverse group of people, many of whom were locals who hadn't visited Faneuil Hall in years.
And we would love to work with the city to solve this problem and would be excited for many vacant storefronts to be turned into these storefront artist studios, as well as a place for communities together. I'll also flag that we are working with 2 departments of the Mayor's Office, both New Urban Mechanics and the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. So I guess while we have that specific desire, we also have 2 general asks that we think could really help this issue.
The first was brought up today already, is a forum for people to flag vacancies. In our experience, everybody has at least one empty storefront that drives them crazy in their neighborhood. Putting all of this on a map would help crowdsource a singular database of the most persistent vacancies. And the data points perhaps could even be collected using the existing see-click-fix interface.
And I think with that, what we're seeing as we try to find what is vacant is that there are so many technicalities of what vacancy means, and that compared to just the lived experience of walking down the street is totally different. And then beyond that, we are interested and excited for a registry to exist of vacancies. We saw the example in Arlington, and we thought that was great that they were able to reduce vacancies very successfully. And I think that one thing we're excited about, particularly within the city of Boston, is ways that we could actually match the problems of vacant storefronts with the strain that a lot of artists are experiencing as they're being pushed to the outskirts of cities and sort of beyond. We think that there's a way to sort of really bring these problems together and also actively work towards finding a straightforward solution to the Boston Creates plan created by Mayor Walsh.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi guys, my name is Alex Ponte Capiang, and I'm a community organizer with City Life Vida Urbana, a nonprofit that helps people facing displacement in Boston. And I basically just wanted to connect, or we've talked about it throughout this meeting, but I wanted to emphasize the connection between vacancies, speculation, and displacement. Like my friend Benji commented earlier, the example of the 197 Green Street is a clear example of displacement, speculation, and vacancy all in one, where family was displaced in the transaction between one owner to a corporate landlord, City Realty. And yeah, it's really hurting the community. And the adjacent property is also on the market for almost $3 million. Wild speculation there. And all these issues are being done, in this case, by the same bad actor, City Realty. And I just feel like there has to be a way that we can pump the brakes on these bad actors and get them to work with community members to see things that will benefit the community there, and not just be the maximum profit for these corporations that, in my opinion, are just a little too greedy. Because, I mean, even in the case where of the property they own on Washington Street, where El Embajador is right now, I know for a fact that affordable housing can be built there. A good amount of units can be built there, and at a reasonable price, if they sold at a reasonable price, and they can still make the profit that would be expected for somebody that owned the property for as long as they have, but they don't want what's expected. They want more than that. And I feel like we can think of creative ways to get bad actors to work with the community. And I just wanted to thank Councilor O'Malley and Councilor Flynn for hosting this meeting. And I know Councilor O'Malley has done a lot of work with the community members and the small businesses that are being impacted by this sort of stuff. So I just wanted to thank you again. And I'm looking forward to see what comes out of these meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And does anybody else, anyone else here like to testify? Hearing none. Before I give it over to my colleague, I'd just like to first say thank you to Mayor Walsh's staff for being here, providing excellent input, suggestions, and the second panel as well. But most importantly, I want to thank the public for coming out, for listening to all the testimony, for being here for several hours. We learned a lot from your testimony. I learned a lot about the subject. And I just want to say thank you for being here and, spending your time with us. And your insight and knowledge about the subject was exceptional. So I'm looking to continue to work with you and with Councilor O'Malley, who's doing great work, along with City Council President as well, Andrea Campbell. So it's an honor to work with you guys on this issue. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this. Thank you to those that stuck around. It's been nearly 3 hours, and I think that underscores the importance of this issue and the fact that it really hits multiple planes here. We talk a lot about intersectionality, and I think the same can be true as we're talking about vacancy, as we talk about business, commercial vacancy, as we talk about residential high-end vacancy, how that can have an effect on the overall housing stock, as we talk about vacant lands and the city's role. So there's a lot of work that we need to do here. As I mentioned earlier, my request to you, Mr. Chairman, is that rather than gaveling this hearing to a close, we recess the hearing, meet again in a working session. Many of you have worked there, but for those who haven't, I can explain. A working session is a less formalized version. We will be literally sitting around a table. I invite everyone here and others that were here earlier. You're all welcome. I obviously want to include those in the business community as well and landlords to have a seat at the table because, as I said in my opening remarks, it's just not about being punitive. It's about seeing ways the city can better work on our timely, costly, and at times ineffective permitting process. So that's something that we can be having a conversation. But at the end of the day, as we talk about what other cities have done, I think there's a real opportunity here to explore that. There'll be a whole host of concerns. I would think that would go into length of vacancy, type of vacancy, whether or not there's been a good faith effort of the landlord to try to bring some businesses as well as some opportunities to look at pop-ups, whether it's with artists, whether it's with other businesses, whether it's with restaurants or beer garden type thing, ways to really activate that space. So I'm excited about this issue. It's a complicated issue. It's a tough issue, but I do think there's an opportunity for a win-win-win all around. So thank you all again for taking the time to join us, particularly those that stayed till the very end. And again, I'd ask you to recess this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to working again with all these soon. Who said that?
Okay. At this time, we're going to adjourn the hearing, but we will continue with working sessions as well. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.